All right, so today we're going to talk about the nervous system, and I'm going to go right from the front just because there's a couple people on here that might not have caught the front. And also, I just want to recap a couple of things for you guys. All right, so it's complex, it's highly organized. It gets its information from your sensory organs, like your skin, your eyes, your ears, and then it sends that information to the spinal cord. And it does that through sensory nerves or afferent nerves. That's your incoming signal that's going up to the brain. It goes to the cerebral cortex in the brain, and then that is going to decide what signals it wants to accept, and whatever signals it accepts, then it's going to send an efferent message back out to the body. That's an outgoing signal back out to the body, and it's going to cause some sort of movement or some sort of action by the body. So once the brain gets it, it sends it back out through the spinal cord, okay, and out to the perspective areas of the body. It directs your body's reaction to external stimuli. It controls most of the internal function, everything from your muscle movement to blood vessel dilation to learning. And it does all that by sending these messages back and forth. They can be both electrical or chemical, and it's how these cells are communicating to one another. So the components of the central and peripheral nervous system are the central nervous, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which consists of your cranial and your spinal nerves. You have 31 of those. Your cranial nerves are 12. Your ganglia, your sensory neurons, neuromuscular junctions. Together, that central nervous system and that peripheral nervous system will work and transmit and process all that sensory information and coordinate the body functions. The brain and the spinal cord act as a control center. They receive the data and the feedback from the sensory organs and from the nerves. They process that data or that feedback, and then they send commands back out. The nerve pathways of the peripheral nervous system are what carries the incoming and the outgoing signals. Again, you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. These connect your brain to your eyes, your ears, and your other sensory organs, as well as your head and your neck muscles. Now, for this course, you do not have to know the 12 cranial nerves. You'll have to know them later, but right now, you have to know what they are and just kind of how they work. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and these branch out from the spinal cord and they go out to places like the chest or the thorax, the abdomen, and the limbs. And they send sensory information. Okay, so they can send sensory information to the brain. Remember, sensory or afferent goes to the brain. They also can receive motor information. So they can produce a response from that motor information sent back from the brain through those efferent nerves. All right, so each nerve is responsible for relaying sensory information, sending motor information, or both. The peripheral nerves have nerve fibers that carry information or stimuli received from the sensory nerves or receptors from the internal and external environment to the central nervous system. So it does that across those afferent or those incoming nerves. So something happens, you're stimulated by something, it sends a message to your brain, and then your brain decides whether it wants to respond to that message. If it decides it wants to, then it sends a message back out to your body through motor or efferent fibers, and that will cause some action or reflex or response to happen. So the brain is the control center. It receives, it processes, it evaluates the input, and it decides on whether or not it wants to take an action. And if it does, it will initiate the response. Responses can be involuntary. These are required to maintain homeostasis in the body, and they're regulated by the autonomic nervous system, like the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And voluntary action, which is controlled by your somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system involves the things that you consciously sense and do, whereas your autonomic nervous system works without you thinking about it. It runs things behind the scenes that will keep you alive. There are different signals that are sent by the brain, and they control different processes. So your brain interprets each one of these. Some of them will make you feel tired. Others might make you feel pain. Some messages are kept in the brain. Others are relayed through the spine, through that network of nerves and out to your extremities. The central nervous system relies on billions of neurons or nerve cells in order for this process to occur. Some of the messages are kept in the brain. Others are sent out through the spine. And again, that is going to send out some sort of message back out to your body to control or to initiate some sort of action. Reflexes are automatic, they're rapid, they're involuntary. So if you touch something hot, what's your immediate reaction? Your hand pulls away, right? That's your reflex. You don't keep your hand on it. As soon as you touch it, a message goes right up to your brain and says, hey, you just touched something hot. And your brain says, oh my God, that's hot. That hurts. And then it sends a message back out and your body automatically releases it. You don't think about it, right? You grab something hot. You don't think about it. By the time you've thought about it, you've already released it because that reflex action is working there. And reflexes are really a protective action. Okay. So when you sneeze, that is a reflex. That's a protective action because bacteria, dirt, something's trying to enter your nose. So your body sneezes to try to push it back out. The same thing when you grab something hot, you touch it, your brain gets a signal. It's like, hey, dummy, that's hot. Let go of it. And you release it. Reflexes control visceral activities, posture. These are things that take place continuously without you even being aware of it. The visceral or autonomic motor system controls involuntary function. And this is functions that are controlled by things like your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, your glands. The system composes two major divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So we talked about this before, and I've said multiple times whenever you have smooth muscle, whenever smooth muscle is involved, you're going to have some sort of a reaction. Your body's going to do something. The layers of the brain are protecting it. Okay. So you have three main layers. These are continuous connective tissue that cover the brain and the spinal cord. So you have the dura mater, that's your outer toughest layer, and it's close to the bone or the outside of the head. It separates to form the dural sinuses, which help collect cerebral spinal fluid to put it back into circulation. The subdura, this is right beneath the dura, and it's going to be empty most of the time. But if someone had a subdural injury, this could be filled with blood. You have the arachnoid space. They call it that because it has a loose web-like covering that looks like a spider and like a spider web actually. And spiders are considered arachnoids. So this arachnoid cover looks like a spider web and is just covering the middle layer of the brain. You have the subarachnoid space. Now you need to remember this because this is where the spinal fluid is. This is also where the cerebral arteries and the veins are, and it lies below the arachnoid. So it's called the subarachnoid space. That's where your cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow and bathe everything. The arachnoid villi, you've heard of villi before in the intestines. These villi are in the brain, and they're finger-like projections, and the cerebral spinal fluid is able to be absorbed through these villi. And that also helps it go back into general circulation. The pia mater, this is the delicate inner tissue. This is closest to the surface of the brain. All the blood vessels are found here, or most of them. A lot of really small ones. Now, your meninges. So, if you've heard of something called meningitis, this is what's affected your meninges. Your meninges are the membranes that cover and protect the brain and the spinal cord. The dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater will protect and anchor the brain. They provide a support system for the blood vessels, the nerves, the lymphatics, and the cerebral spinal fluid. The meninges cover and protect the brain and the spinal cord, and they run from the brain all the way down the spinal cord. So if you've ever heard of someone having a rigid neck because they have meningitis or pain in the hip or the knee area, it's because it runs down that back like a tight cord. Usually it's a little flexible, but when it's inflamed, it becomes inflexible and it becomes really tight and painful when you pull on it or when you manipulate it. And it goes from the spinal cord to the brain. So when someone has meningitis, that whole area can be inflamed, tight, and painful. Cerebral spinal fluid, besides protecting the brain, okay, it provides a cushion for the brain and the spinal cord. It also flows through the ventricles, through that subarachnoid space. There has to be equal amounts of it being produced and reabsorbed constantly. That helps maintain the intracranial pressure. There's nutrients in there that the brain is able to use. So, what do you need to know about this? You should know some of the constitution of it, mainly that it has electrolyte, glucose, and protein in it normally. It should be clear. It tells us about the cranial pressure. We can look at it to see if someone has an infection. You should know where it's located at in the brain, in that subarachnoid space. It's produced by the choroid plexus, in the ventricles of the brain, usually the third and fourth. And it's completely replaced every few hours because that cerebral spinal fluid is bringing any waste away from the brain. It's clear. It should be almost colorless. It looks like plasma, but a difference in the concentrations of electrolytes, glucose, and protein. You might also see an occasional white blood cell in it. You should not see red blood cells in it. Red blood cells would indicate a brain bleed or an issue. It's going to be a little acidic, about 7.32 to 7.35. There should be nothing else in that spinal fluid. So if we see something clear after a head injury, leaking from the ear or the nose, we're going to check it for cerebral spinal fluid. There's a couple ways we do that. One, we can check for glucose. Two, we could put like a little 4x4 underneath the ear or underneath the nose, and that would collect liquid. And that liquid is usually going to come in the shape of a halo. And if you get that halo, we call it a concentric ring, but it looks like a halo. That's an indication that it's likely cerebral spinal fluid and we have some sort of brain injury. So, main things you need to know: it protects the brain, it moves throughout that subarachnoid space, it's constantly changed out, it's removing wastes. The constitution, electrolyte, glucose, protein, no red blood cells it should have, and it might have an occasional white blood cell. And what do we use it for? We can analyze. So we can look at the pressure. We can look at the appearance of it. It should be clear. If it's cloudy, they probably have an infection. We look for the protein, the glucose, the cell count, and what kind of cells it has. And we can also stain it if we feel like someone had an infection to look for the organism that might be causing that infection. So the choroid plexus, this is a highly vascularized area of brain. It's in the ventricles, the third and fourth, and that's where that cerebral spinal fluid is produced. But then it goes to the subarachnoid space where it circulates, removes the waste, gets sucked up by those arachnoid villi, back into the dural sinuses, and back into circulation. Again, characteristics, I've already talked to you about most of those. This is just a basic chart, but I talked about the ones you need to know. It should be clear and colorless, no red blood cells, once in a while a white blood cell, protein, glucose. Those are the main things you need to know. You also have a blood-brain barrier. This protects the brain. It has impermeable capillaries, these tightly locked layers of cells that protect it from harmful substances entering it that could damage it. So it also helps control the balance of the electrolytes, the glucose, and the proteins. And you have a similar one in the blood cerebral spinal fluid barrier. And that's at that choroid plexus we talked about. That helps control and protect the cerebral spinal fluid. The blood-brain barrier is more than likely the one they would ask you about. That's poorly developed in babies. So substances like bilirubin or other toxic materials can easily enter the baby's brain. It can lead to something called kernicterus, which they might ask you about, too much bilirubin, and that can cause brain damage in the baby. So this is why when a baby has jaundice, we got to treat them right away because we don't want that bilirubin staying in the body. It needs to be removed. That bilirubin can cross that blood-brain barrier, cause something called kernicterus, and damage the baby's brain. When fully developed, the blood-brain barrier is also a disadvantage because sometimes we need to treat certain cancers or certain infections in the brain. And because of that blood-brain barrier, we may not be able to get the drugs, the antibiotics, or the cancer drugs into the brain that we need. But things like alcohol can easily cross the blood-brain barrier. So this is why people that go to parties, frat parties, they drink exorbitant amounts of alcohol and they end up with toxic poisoning. Okay, one, it crosses the stomach really easily. It just diffuses right into the bloodstream, and then it goes to the brain. And in the brain, it doesn't need any help. It can go right into the area where nothing else can go and cause damage to that part of the brain. So for alcoholics, that's going to be a constant. They're constantly drinking. It's going to constantly cross that barrier and affect parts of the brain. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, how it can cause something called Wernicke's encephalopathy, where it affects the Wernicke's portion of the brain. And that Wernicke's portion has to do with your ability to comprehend and understand language and speech. In that brain, you have the cerebral hemispheres. These make up the largest obvious portions of the brain. There's a longitudinal fissure that separates each one. Each hemisphere is divided into the four major lobes, each of which has a specific function. The diencephalon is the central portion of the brain. It's surrounded by the hemispheres. In that diencephalon is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. You have the brain stem that connects the brain to the spinal cord. The brainstem is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And then the cerebellum is just below the pons and the medulla, below the occipital lobe. So the three main parts of the brain are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebellum is at the back of the brain, below the cerebrum. It coordinates your voluntary movement like posture, balance, coordination, and speech. Damage to the cerebellum would result in problems with balance, movement, or muscle coordination, also known as ataxia. The brainstem is the lower part of the brain. It connects to the spinal cord. It has the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata. The brainstem controls your basic life sustaining function, the heart rate, your breathing, your sleeping, your eating. Any damage to the brainstem results in life threatening conditions like difficulty breathing, heart problems, and loss of consciousness. The cerebrum, these are the two cerebral hemispheres, right and left. They make up the largest part of the brain. Each hemisphere is divided into 4 lobes. They all have a specific function. The cerebrum is made of 2 types of tissue, gray matter and white matter. Gray matter forms the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, known as the cerebral cortex, and it is associated with things like processing and cognition. White matter forms the bulk of the deeper part of the brain. There are glial cells there and myelinated axons, and these connect the gray matter areas. The cerebrum has an appearance that looks like sulci or grooves and depressions, gyri, which are ridges or elevations, and anatomically it's divided into 2 symmetrical hemispheres by that longitudinal fissure. The cerebral cortex is divided into 4 lobes, and again, they're associated with the corresponding cranial bone that they lie over. The brain, or the function of the brain, that higher function, that thought, that action, that emotion, that interpretation of sensory data takes place here at the cerebral cortex. If the cerebral cortex were damaged, depending on the area affected, it could cause things like memory loss, impaired cognitive skills, changes in personality, loss of motor control. Any questions so far? So your right and left hemisphere, they're similar in structure, but not in function. The dominant hemisphere of the brain is the one that controls your language. For most people, that's going to be the left hemisphere. It's also responsible for things like math, problem solving, logical reasoning. The right hemisphere, I call my prince side, my artistic side. And that has a greater influence on artistic abilities, creativity, spatial relationships, would have to do with a lot about where you are in space, in time, emotional and behavioral characteristics. On the left side of the brain, you have 2 areas. You have to know about these, okay? One is Broca, and Broca is the motor or expressive speech area. This is for verbal and written. So a lot of times I'll joke about my Broca because when I try to say words, sometimes they come out wrong. They don't sound right. I know the word, I know what I want to say, but it doesn't come out. So when the Broca is broken, you have difficulty saying the word, okay? Or sometimes even writing it. With Wernicke's, this is comprehending the language. So this is both written and spoken. Okay. So Broca's is referring to expressive speech. Wernicke's refers to receptive speech. And if there's a problem with both of them, it would be called global. So if I ask you about expressive aphasia, I'm talking about broca. Okay. My broca is broken. I can't say it well or I can't write it well, but I understand it. If my Wernicke's is broken, I can't say it well. I can't understand it or write it well. I might be able to say it, but I might not understand it. So Wernicke's encephalopathy is something people that are alcoholics develop, where it starts to affect that part of their brain over time. But if you ever seen somebody that's really drunk, like on Cops, you watch Cops on TV and you see them when they pull people over that are highly intoxicated. If you notice, they really can't understand or follow commands. So that part of the brain is being affected. When they can't speak it or say it, then that Broca part is being affected. But when they can't comprehend or understand, then it's Wernicke's. So remember, Broca's is expressive, Wernicke's is receptive, and if both of them are broken, then the client won't talk. And also, if both of them are broken, it's considered global. You have to
Oh,
know that. So when these areas don't function, the client doesn't talk. Wernicke's is about comprehending that language, both written and spoken. Complex functions such as language and memory can involve several areas of the brain. Each hemisphere is concerned with voluntary movement and sensory function in the opposite side of the body. Okay, so the right side of the brain is controlling the left side of the body and vice versa. The left hemisphere controls the right hand side of the body, receives information from the right visual field, controlling speech, language, recognition of words, letters, and numbers. And the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, receives information from the left visual field, and it's controlling creativity, context, and recognition of faces, places, and objects. Any questions on any of that? The prefrontal cortex is part of your frontal lobe right behind your forehead. It affects your behavior, your personality, and your ability to plan. One of the most important jobs is executive function or ability to self regulate and plan ahead. It provides components for expression of personality. If someone has a problem with their prefrontal cortex, they're going to have a problem with impulse control. So they may run out into the street after a ball without looking both ways. Oh, it's a good idea to strip here. Let me just strip. Um, oh, I don't want to take this test. I'm just gonna go home. They'll do things without thinking. They just do it all the time, and they lack that impulse. They lack that control, so they'll just make a decision. Okay, it's called impulsiveness, where they make a decision and just do something. It also can affect social relationships. The basonuclei. Now, I've talked about this. I talked about this when I drew that picture of that hippocampus on the board. I drew a picture of your basonuclei, which is deep in your brain, and that's part of your EPS system. EPS is movement. There are clusters of cell bodies or gray matter here deep in the tracts of the cerebral hemisphere. They're part of the EPS system of motor control, and this controls and coordinates skeletal muscle activity, prevents excessive movement, and initiates accessory and often involuntary movements like arm swinging when you walk. Now, if you remember, you're just normally walking, right? And your arms are swinging. That's part of your balance, part of your control, part of your coordination. You're not thinking about it. But when you give somebody psychotropics, okay, like for schizophrenia, some of those drugs, especially those typical anti-psychotropics, those old ones like Haldol, those can affect this system, the EPS, and that's what they call them, extrapyramidal symptoms, right? and they're pill rolling or they're shuffling their feet or they're smacking their lips because that part of the brain is being affected, causing it to make abnormal movement. Some of you guys might do something called an Ames form at work. I have to do it whenever I give somebody psychotropic drugs, and it tracks involuntary movement that's being caused by these drugs that we don't really want to happen. Because if you don't fix it, it'll end up becoming a permanent part of their body movement. And that's when it's called tardive dyskinesia. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. They do commercials for it. That's the part of the brain that's being affected by these drugs. Okay, so your basal nuclei, also known as your basal ganglia, that is controlling that movement. Your ganglia, these are just nerves or brain cells that are closely alike. And they might share connections or jobs. They work together as part of a big system to help that nervous system function. The basal ganglia are best known for how they help your brain control the movement in your body. They're a key part of the network of brain cells and nerves that control the voluntary function. If the basal ganglia approve a signal, then it will move along the motor pathways and the nerves that carry the signal to the spinal cord and the nerves to that destination muscle. If they don't approve the signal, because remember, the brain can decide what it wants to do and what it doesn't want to do, it can redirect it into another area. The basal nuclei or the basal ganglia is part of that EPS system. This is a series of pathways in the central nervous system, and it helps control involuntary movement and it helps maintain your posture. It also helps regulate involuntary movement. You also have in the midbrain your substantia nigra, and that also helps with that basal nuclei and your EPS system. The limbic system, there's a lot of nuclei there. There are also fibers that help connect from the cerebral hemisphere to that brain stem. The limbic system is responsible for your emotional reactions or feelings. And I always think about doing the limbo because when you're at a party, you're doing the limbo, you're having fun. You know, you're happy, you're feeling good. And that's what your limbic system is, but it controls all your emotions, not just your good ones. It has a lot of connections to all areas of the brain. Any cognitive decision arising from the higher cortical center can be accompanied by an emotional aspect. So, like you got a new job, okay? Your body's processing this, you're happy, and you're processing it intellectually, cognitively, but also it's going to bring along that feeling of elation or of highness that you're happy that you just got this job, or like if you were processing a death in the family, okay, or something along that lines, then it could also bring along those feelings of low or angry or upset. Part of the hypothalamus is involved with the limbic system. The hypothalamus is the link for the autonomic responses like your blood pressure or nausea. So if the limbic system and that are connected, the hypothalamus, then it is explainable if you were anxious or fearful, your blood pressure might go up. If you saw something or smelled something that was unpleasant, it might cause you to vomit or at least gag. So the hypothalamus and the limbic system can work together during autonomic responses, like when you're fearful, when you have excitement. The diencephalon is part of the brain that is surrounded by the hemispheres. It contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus. So the thalamus is the part of the brain that's relaying the sensory and the motor signals from various locations like the basal ganglia to the cerebral cortex. It acts as a relay center for those incoming sensory impulses. It transmits the impulses to the cerebral cortex and other areas of the brain. And the thalamus is also connected with almost all parts of the central nervous system. It influences a lot of different processes in the brain. The hypothalamus helps maintain homeostasis, helps control the autonomic nervous system, most of the endocrine system. It regulates temperature, intake of fluid and food, regulates those sleep cycles. It's also key to your stress response, as we saw when we did the fight or flight. It plays a major role in emotional responses from the limbic system and your sex drive or your libido. It also helps with homeostasis. It influences the autonomic nervous system by managing either the autonomic nervous system itself directly or through hormone release and inhibition. It makes some of the hormones itself that are stored in places like your posterior and anterior pituitary gland. It sends hormones out to your pituitary gland, and it also influences whether or not those hormones are released. Then you have the epithalamus, which helps connect the limbic system to other parts of the body. All right, so that hypothalamus, we already learned quite a bit about it, but it's helping with temperature. It's helping with the endocrine system. It's helping with hunger. And it's just processing signals from receptors in the body. So again, the receptors for our thermostat. The receptors for whether we're hungry or whether we're full. The receptors for whether we're thirsty or not. It works with the hippocampus to form new memories. Remember that hippocampus is your memory center. It generates reactions for emotional responses through that limbic system. It helps with our sleep-wake cycle, which is our circadian rhythm. And again, this one here, if you look at it, it's talking about this occurs due to exposure of light as a stimulus. And we know that. We also know that when someone has some sundowners, we can actually expose them to light during the daytime, and that can help with that sundowners because that light exposure can help reset that circadian rhythm in there. It also produces the reward pathways in the brains. Okay. We talked about that a little bit in class. And the reward pathways is when something triggers your brain, it makes it happy and it wants more of it. Okay. So, like sexual activity, eating a chocolate bar. Unfortunately, there could be good and bad with this because your brain likes any kind of reward. So, for some people, this is why they become addicted to drugs like cocaine, heroin, things like that, because they start to take it, the body starts to respond to it. But over time, it's just going to mess the brain up because it's going to make it, if you continue to take it, it's not going to work right. It's going to make it function differently. The reticular activating system. Okay. This is, I call it RAS. It's a different RAS from the one that we were talking about with the kidneys and all that. Okay. This is the reticular activating system. This is in your brain cell. And I will say the RAS will arouse your ass because this reticular activating system is our degree of arousal or awareness in the cerebral cortex. When you take certain things like narcotics or other drugs, it can depress that area and depress your awareness. So a lot of things could affect that, even some sort of brain injury that could affect that awareness. The brainstem connects the brain to the spinal cord. It's part of the central nervous system. It consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. They all have their own unique structure and function, but together they regulate breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and a lot of other important functions in the body. So the midbrain is the top part of the brainstem. It regulates eye movement. The pons is the middle portion of the brain stem that helps coordinate facial movements, hearing, and balance. And the medulla oblongata is helping you regulate your breathing, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and swallowing. And also your reticular activating system is there. And that is for your arousal. The brainstem also has 10 of the 12 cranial nerves that start in your brain, and those control facial movement, sensation, and taste. The midbrain is the most superior part of the brainstem. Again, you have the reticular activating system there, and that is your arousal system. There are a lot of connections to different parts of the brain there that help with your awareness. Drugs can affect that reticular activating system, decreasing input to the cerebral cortex or the diencephalon. So it can affect your breathing and your awareness. The pons, here we have afferent. Remember, those are incoming sensory nerves. Those are bringing signals into the brain. Hey, I'm hot. I'm cold. This hurt. I need to move my leg. Efferent, that is the actual movement that is conducted. So it's sending it back out to the body, okay? And it's going to cause me, if I'm hot, it might cause me to vasodilate and cool down. If I'm cold, it might cause me to shiver. If I need to move my leg, it can cause me to move my leg. If I need to drop something or grab something. The pons acts as a bridge between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. There are a lot of the cranial nerves there. The pons acts as an important tool in functioning of the autonomic nervous system. It provides a route for the signals to travel to and from the brain. Any injury to the pons can impair your cranial nerve function that's associated with that part of the brain stem. So it could cause damage to the facial sensation area. So if you've ever done like a cranial nerve test where you ran like a cotton ball down somebody's cheek, it would affect their ability to feel that. Eye movement. Maybe they can't move their eyes the direction that we want to. We do that 6 cardinal fields of gaze to check this. Hearing, taste, and more. So all these things could be affected. Your medulla oblongata is the vital control center that regulates your respiratory and cardiovascular function. It coordinates the cough, reflex, the swallowing, and the vomiting reflexes. It's located where there are several cranial nerves. It manages your heart, your circulation, your breathing. The medulla is where the cardiovascular and respiratory system link together to control heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, and more. It manages automatic processes without thinking about it. Some examples are coughing, sneezing, swallowing, vomiting, maintaining balance. Nerve connections occur here. The majority of the major nerves will converge at the spine and carry signals to and from the brain. This means those signals have to pass directly through the medulla. Several of the 12 cranial nerves that connect your throat and your tongue directly to your brain pass through that medulla. You also have a crossover point there. This is where the pyramids are located. And in these pyramids is where the nerves cross over, okay, going from the right side of the body to the left side of the brain and vice versa, from the left side of the body to the right side of the brain. So this is why the brain always controls the opposite side of the body. Left side controls right side controls left side. Again, the medulla is where the pyramids are. This is where the nerves crisscross. You have also a part in the body called decussation of the pyramids. This is where the fibers cross over to the other side of the brain to reach the other cerebral hemisphere. And it controls voluntary movement on the opposite side of the body. You also have the pyramids of the medulla. Okay, that's formed by the pyramidal tracts. These are the tracts that are going to carry the voluntary motor output from the cerebrum out to the spinal cord. You have the cortical spinal tract, also known as the pyramid tract, and it's carrying that movement information from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. So remember that the pyramids, the cortical spinal tract, they're the same thing, okay? I know nursing likes to have two names for everything. And what this cortical spinal tract or this pyramidal tract is doing is carrying the movement related, so that efferent signal from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, it's part of the descending spinal tract that is going to carry that signal back down to the trunk, back down to the limbs of the body, or to your nerves in the chest area to cause some sort of action to occur. So that cortical spinal tract, that pyramidal tract, is the major pathway to carry information from the brain to the spinal cord. And the neurons that travel in that tract, in that cortical spinal tract or that pyramidal tract, are called the upper motor neurons. Now, those upper motor neurons are going to cause an action called a synapse. Okay. The synapse is just that neuron acting to give that signal or conduct that signal on down the line so that it can get out to other people or other neurons, I should say. So a synapse is just an electrical signal, okay? It's not a whole big thing that's confusing. So if you just think about it, when the signal comes in, it's going to come in afferent. It's a sensory signal. Your body needs to do something. Okay. It's going to send that signal to your cerebral cortex. Your cerebral cortex is going to want that body now to engage in some sort of action because of that signal it received. So you touched a curling iron, it was hot. It comes along that afferent nerve, goes to the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex decides it's going to respond. So now it's going to engage by sending an electrical signal out through that cortical spinal tract or that pyramidal tract, okay, with that motor neuron, that upper motor neuron. When it gets down to the spinal cord, where the lower motor neurons are, okay, the lower motor neurons are actually what makes the muscle move. So now you have the upper motor neuron. It's going to come down the spinal cord, descending on that cortical or that pyramidal spinal tract. It's descending down and it's going to stimulate or innervate, okay, through that electrical signal. So it sends an electrical signal from the upper motor to the lower motor neuron, and that's going to cause that electrical stimulation of that muscle to move and cause that muscle contraction or cause that muscle movement or cause that hand to move away, cause that reflex. It's going to cause some action to happen there. Any questions on that? Now you have the cerebellum just below the pons and the medulla, and it's coordinating the movement, helping you maintain posture, helping you maintain your equilibrium. It makes little adjustments. It gets input from proprioceptors. Okay, these are receptors in your joint that tell you where you are in space, where you are in relationship to something. So, do you ever see somebody going down the steps and they missed the step and they fell right on their face? When older people do this, and a lot of times it's not even much of a step, you'll notice it's only a tiny step they tried to go down, but they fell. Why? Because they don't know where they are in relation to where their step is. Their foot is telling them that they're down, but they're not. And it hasn't really anything to do with touch or feel. It has more to do with sensation. Where am I within time? Where am I within space? So they think their foot is down, but it's not. Another example of this is you go to grab a cup on the counter and you swing your arm around to grab it and you totally miss it. Okay? Because you think it was closer to you than it was and you missed it. That is your proprioceptors. It's telling you where you are in relation to where something else is in space and time. So that input being sent into those proprioceptors in the muscles and the joints, okay, is being sent up to the brain. Someone that has a stroke might have a problem with this. Someone that has some sort of brain damage in that area can have a problem with this because they don't know where they are in relation to space and time, or they can't maintain their posture. They can't maintain their balance. They also get input in the cerebellum from your eyes, from your vestibular, which is your ears. So it's a combination of things here that are maintaining that equilibrium. If you have a problem with your ears, something called Meniere's disease, where you have too much fluid in your ears, that can affect your coordination. There can be other damage to the ears that can affect your coordination. There can be damage to your brain that causes a problem with these proprioceptors or that input coming from those proprioceptors. There could be a problem with your eyes also, because if you had like nystagmus or something like that, that can change the way that signal comes in. Damage to the cerebellum, okay, can result in trouble keeping your balance while standing or walking, trouble reaching for objects because your hand would miss an object if you were trying to pick it up. It could also cause a problem for you to learn new words or new skills. Damage to the cerebellum can interfere with judgment when we're talking about the size or the distance you are from objects. So this could cause them a problem with driving. It can also affect your sense of timing. Any questions on that? Brain blood, okay? Your brain is delicate and we need a constant, perfect circulation in there all the time. The blood is being supplied to the brain by the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. And the internal carotid arteries branch off either your right or left common carotid artery. You also have the carotid sinus. This is where your baroreceptors are located. They can detect changes in your blood pressure. You have the chemoreceptors, which we talked about, and those can detect changes in your pH or your oxygen level. At the base of the brain, you have two internal carotid arteries, and they divide into anterior and middle cerebral arteries. The anterior cerebral artery will supply the frontal lobe of the brain. The middle cerebral artery supplies the lateral part of the cerebral hemisphere, mostly the temporal and the parietal lobes. And then you have the posterior vertebral arteries, which will join to form the basilar artery, and that supplies the branches to the brain stem and the cerebellum. Now, these arteries are going to form together, okay? And they're going to form what they call the circle of Willis. The circle of Willis is the joining area of several arteries at the bottom side of the brain. Here, your internal carotid arteries branch into smaller arteries, and they supply the oxygenated blood to about 80% of the cerebrum. At the base of the brain, the basilar artery divides into right and left posterior cerebral arteries. Those supply the occipital lobes, the anterior and posterior cerebral arteries over the hemisphere. And so together, these all make up that circle of Willis. We have anastomosis here between the major arteries, the anterior communicating artery, the posterior communicating arteries, and they form the circle of Willis to give an alternative source of blood in case the internal carotid or vertebral artery is obstructed. So these arteries surround the pituitary gland and the optic chiasm. I would know about the circle of Willis, okay? The main function of the circle of Willis is to provide collateral blood flow between the anterior and posterior arterial systems of the brain. It gives an alternate blood flow pathways between the right and left cerebral hemispheres. The way the circle protects the brain from ischemia and stroke in cases of vascular obstruction or damage. The arterial anastomotic circle connects the two major arterial systems to the brain, the internal carotid arteries and the vertebrobasilar arteries. So it helps connect everything here and form the circle of Willis. It's really meant as a way of protection. The blood flow in the cerebral arteries is constant. The brain cells constantly use oxygen and glucose. They need it for the neurons. This provides nutrients for those neurons. There is little storage capacity in the brain. I would know that. Autoregulation is a way in which the body is able to increase carbon dioxide levels or decrease pH in the blood or decrease the blood pressure in an area of a brain. And it results in immediate local vasodilation. Baroreceptors and chemoreceptors will protect the brain from damage related to abnormal blood pressure or pH levels. The venous blood from the brain collects in the dural sinuses and drains into the right and left internal jugular veins to be returned to the heart. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. They come from the brain. They originate in the brain stem. There's my Broca, see? They originate from the brain stem. They pass through the foramina into the skull to serve structures in the head and neck, including the ears and the eyes. The first two nerves, the olfactory and the optic, come from the cerebrum. The names of the cranial nerves relate to their function and where they're numerically identified in the Roman numerals. Each cranial nerve can be described as sensory, meaning afferent, or motor, meaning efferent, or both. So they can stimulate a sensory, a motor action, or both. The four cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9, and 10, are parasympathetic fibers. So they help with that parasympathetic function in the body. All right, I put this on here for you just in case you want to learn them, but you're not required for this class, but just so you can see what they are and how they work. Also, if you want to learn them, that's the mnemonic we had to learn. All right, let's go on. Any questions from any of that first part? All right, now we're moving on to the spinal cord and the spinal nerves. So, spinal cord continuous with the brain, it's sending that sensory information from the body up to the brain and motor information from the brain back out to the body. It's a place where the reflexes are coordinated. The control of the reflexes can be controlled independently from the brain. Along the spinal cord, spinal nerves emerge that will carry both sensory and motor information. Spinal nerves are an integral part of the peripheral nervous system. They're the structures that the central nervous system uses to receive its sensory information from the body and through which the activity of the trunk and the limbs is regulated. They also transmit motor commands from central nervous system to the muscles. They're composed of both sensory and motor fibers, as well as autonomic fibers. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they come out from the spinal cord to exit the vertebral canal. The spinal cord itself is protected by that bony vertebral column, the meninges, and the cerebral spinal fluid. The cord is continuous with the medulla oblongata. It ends at the first lumbar vertebrae. After that first lumbar vertebrae is a bundle of nerve roots known as cauda equina. This is the spot where we typically will go to get a lumbar puncture. So we go in the first lumbar level between the L3 and the L4. This is the least likely place to cause damage. All right, we talked a little bit about the white matter and the gray matter. And that gray matter is going to be your anterior horns, your posterior horns, and your lateral horns. We'll talk about them in a minute. If you look at this picture, you see the spinal nerves, and you can see that different nerves are associated with different parts of that spinal area. So, like if you look at the phrenic nerve, okay, that phrenic nerve is stimulated. That's going to stimulate your respiration. And then it'll go down to the thoracic area. It'll send that nerve down there. That stimulation to that nerve down there will stimulate the intercostal muscles for respiration. If your parasympathetic nervous system were to be engaged, then you have spinal nerves in that thoracic area between T1 and L2 that are going to stimulate your heart, your blood vessels, your temperature. And then if you go down into your sacral area, sacral 1 to sacral 5, you have the parasympathetic nerves there that would trigger the function for your bowel, your bladder, your genitalia. And then, of course, on the left, you can see C5 through T1 is going to help with movement of the arms. L1 through L3, through S3 are going to help with movement of your legs. So damage in these areas of the spinal cord could affect function to those areas of the body. Spinal cord's function is to conduct impulses from the brain to the body and generate reflexes that make the functioning smooth. The spinal cord has white matter that contains the spinal cord tracts, myelinated fiber, the gray matter, which contains the nerve cell bodies, the dendrites, and the non myelinated axons. In that gray matter, you have three distinct areas: the ventral horn, which has the motor neurons, the dorsal horn, which has inner neurons that receive information from the sensory neurons, and then the lateral horns, which have the motor neurons. Tracts are a group of nerve fibers that pass through the spinal cord. So I already talked about the descending tracts a little bit. You also have ascending tracts. Now, ascending tracts are going up to the brain. So your afferent fibers are going to move along those ascending tracts to take the signal to the brain. And then you have the descending tract, which is going to bring that movement signal, okay, from the brain back out. That's descending because it's coming from the brain back out to the body to conduct some sort of action. So ascending tracts are just the pathway through which that sensory or that afferent information is coming from the body, okay, along the nerves, going up to the cerebral cortex. And descending is those efferent signals coming back from the brain out to the spinal cord to conduct some sort of activity or movement. The pyramidal or cortical spinal tracts are sending those impulses concerned with voluntary movement from the motor cortex, from those upper motor neurons down to those lower motor neurons at the appropriate level of the spinal cord. So remember, it's coming from the brain back out to those upper motor neurons, and it's either going to stimulate something there or it's going to send that electrical signal on down to those lower motor neurons and stimulate from there. Extrapyramidal tracts carry impulses that modify and coordinate voluntary movement and maintain posture. Lower motor neurons can receive stimulatory or inhibitory from the upper motor neurons. So these upper motor neurons could cause an action to occur, or it can inhibit an action. Depends on what the brain decides to do, what type of input it needs to send there. Ascending tracts send information from the body to the brain. Descending tracts carry information from the brain to the body. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come out from the spinal cord. We just saw them on that picture. They carry motor and sensory information to and from the organs and the tissue of the body, and they're named by where they're located on the vertebral column from where they emerge from. And as you saw, I went over some of the numbers. They're numbered with each section. So like you have 8 pairs of cervical nerves from C1 to C8. They're connected to the spinal cord by spinal roots. The spinal nerves leave the spinal cord through those little spaces in the vertebrae. And by leaving that area, they're able to conduct sensory information. The ascending tracts are carrying the impulse from the body to the spinal cord to the brain. The descending tracts carry the impulse from the brain to the spinal cord to conduct an action. So remember, afferent carries information from the body to the brain. Efferent carries information from the brain back out to the muscles and the gland, where it's either going to inhibit or stimulate some action. Dermatomes are an area of skin that's supplied by one of these single spinal nerves. Assessment of sensory awareness using the dermatome map can help us determine where there's damage done to the spinal cord. Each dermatome is associated with a single spinal nerve. The nerves transmit the sensations like pain from a specific area of the skin to the central nervous system. Dermatomes help assess and diagnose a variety of conditions. For example, they can indicate a problem along a specific dermatome. You got to know this, okay? Shingles, for example, is reactivation of varicella zoster or chickenpox. So it'll lie dormant along the nerve roots in your body, and it'll occur along certain dermatomes or along the nerve line. And you probably hear people say this, how the shingles goes right across the nerve line. So it'll go in a straight line across, usually, those little bumps. And the pain. Radiculopathy, this is like sciatica nerve. So pain from these can follow one or more of these dermatomes. Some of these can network. Network means that, like the phrenic nerves, for example, they consist of fibers from C3 to C5, and the sciatic nerve contains fibers from spinal nerves L4, L5, S1, and S3. The fibers in each spinal nerve can be distributed in several peripheral nerves. This can minimize the effects of damage to one area of the spinal cord on a person's ability to contract those muscles. So sometimes that does help us a little bit. Reflexes are automatic. These are rapid involuntary response to a stimuli. It involves a sensory stimuli from a receptor along that afferent incoming sensory nerve, followed by a synapse or that electrical signal in the spinal cord or the cranial nerve, and then we'll have a responding efferent or outgoing motor impulse to elicit the response. Many reflexes control autonomic activity or posture that happens continuously without you being aware. Each person has acquired or learned reflexes as well, like you've learned how to ride a bike. Certain basic reflexes, like your patellar knee jerk reflex or your oculocephalic reflex, are helpful in diagnosis. So, with the oculocephalic, this is called the doll's head reflex. We use this on patients that are comatose. And what we'll do is we'll turn the head. Now, when we turn the head, the eyes should move in the opposite direction of the head. This tells you that the brain stem is intact. If the eyes stay fixed or they move the same direction, then we know we have a brain injury. Any absent, weak, or abnormal response can indicate presence of neurological problems and can show locations of the spinal cord damage. Neurons, these communicate with other neurons, muscles, or glands to generate and conduct those impulses in the body. The nerve impulses are changes in the electrical property of the neuron's membrane. The cells have an electrical charge associated with their membrane. Neurons or nerve cells are highly specialized. They're non mitotic cells and they conduct impulses in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. They require glucose and oxygen, and they have specific structural characteristics based on their function. The dendrite is the receptor site. It conducts impulses towards the cell body. The cell body has the nucleus. The axon conducts its impulses away from the cell body toward the effector site or the connecting neuron and releases the neurotransmitter chemicals at the terminal point. So the dendrite is the receptor site, and it's going to conduct an impulse towards the cell body where that nucleus is. The axon will send the impulse away from the cell body towards the effector site or the correcting neuron so it can release the neurotransmitter chemical at the terminal point. Many nerve fibers are covered by a myelin sheath that can insulate the fiber and speed up the rate of conduction. That's important to know because in someone that has something like multiple sclerosis, they have a problem with their myelin sheath and they have a problem with being able to conduct that nerve transmission. This can also be destroyed in numerous conditions like Guillain-Barré syndrome. Different parts of the body, different things are affected. But once that myelin sheath is damaged or destroyed, it affects the ability of that nerve conduction to be able to occur. The myelin sheath is formed by Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system and oligodendrites in the central nervous system. You also have interruptions in these myelin sheath called the nodes of Ranvier. And this little interruptions helps it to skip along or move faster because of those little pauses. The neurons are supported and protected by a large number of glial cells, astroglio or astrocytes. These help to link the neurons. They provide support. It also helps with the blood-brain barrier. You have oligodendrocytes. These provide the myelin for the axons in the central nervous system. You have microglia. These provide phagocytic activity, and epidermal cells, which line the ventricles and the neurotube cavity to help form that choroid plexus where that cerebral spinal fluid is produced. Neurons cannot undergo cell division. If the cell body's damaged, the neuron is going to die. In the peripheral nervous system, axons are able to regenerate if the cell body is viable. After damage to the axon occurs, the section distal to the injury would degenerate because it's not getting any nutrients. So it would be removed by macrophages and Schwann cells. And then the Schwann cell can try to form a new tube at the end of the remaining axon. The cell body would become larger and be able to synthesize additional proteins for the growth of the replacement axon. Neurogenesis is the production of new neurons in certain parts of the brain, especially that hippocampal area, which is important because that's your memory. It's also been shown that hippocampal neurogenesis is critical to the formation of new memories and can be stimulated by lifestyle changes like increasing your exercise. Neurons communicate through electrical potentials or action potentials. The action potentials are based on movement of ions. So it's just electrical activity here that's happening, guys. And it's an all or nothing process. The neurons have electrical excitability, which is the ability to respond to stimuli by generating nerve impulses. The stimulus increases the permeability of the neuron's membrane. So this allows things to move through it, okay? Particularly sodium. It's now able to move into the cell, depolarize it, and generate this action potential. The change in the positive electrical charge allows an increase in the permeability of the connecting area, and the impulse is allowed or able to move across that membrane. Complex electrical circuits exist in that nervous system. So you have multiple electrical activity or synapses on each neuron. And the electrical activity can be monitored when we put an EEG. So if someone's having excessive electrical activity, like a seizure, okay, we can look at it with this EEG. We can look at brain activity with that EEG. The change to a positive electrical charge in the membrane allows increases in the permeability. So this allows that impulse to move. Complex electrical circuits exist in that nervous system. Again, we're able to measure those on that EEG. Recovery or repolarization will happen as that potassium moves out. The normal permeability of the membrane is restored. The sodium potassium pump will now return the sodium to the extracellular location and the potassium back in the cell. In myelinated fibers, the action potential is generated at the nodes of Ranvier only. Therefore, an impulse can skip along or do what we call saltatory conduction, where it rapidly moves along there. Larger axons conduct impulses more rapid than smaller ones. The speed of the action potential is influenced by the diameter of the axon and by its myelination. So remember that myelination is that insulation on the outside. Those myelinated axons are able to carry those action potentials much faster. Usually this whole thing that's taking place here requires a presynaptic and a postsynaptic cell. So it's moving from the presynaptic to the postsynaptic cell. And again, that postsynaptic cell might be like a cardiac muscle cell, a smooth muscle cell, a skeletal muscle cell, wherever we need that action to happen. A chemical synapse involves the release of neurotransmitters. These transmitters can stimulate or inhibit the postsynaptic neuron. The synapse usually consists of a terminal axon, presynaptic neuron, and that contains the vesicles with the neurotransmitter and the receptor site on the membrane or the postsynaptic neuron. So if you look at the picture, you can see how the impulse is being conducted along there. From one, the presynaptic, which is going to be on the left, to that postsynaptic, which is on the right. The synaptic cleft, that's where the neurotransmitters are released, or where that action potential, that electrical signal, that impulse takes place. There's receptors on these neurotransmitters, and those receptors help them either attach to the new neuron or go back up into the old neuron, whatever it's supposed to do. Remember, each one has a different job it's supposed to do when it enters there. Some of the neurotransmitters that you're going to need to know: acetylcholine. This is present at the neuromuscular junction in the autonomic nervous system and the peripheral nervous system mostly. This is going to be responsible for helping you conduct a muscle contraction. So the acetylcholine is released, the muscle contraction occurs, and then something comes along and destroys the acetylcholine. Okay? If it doesn't do that, the muscle will just continue to contract. Norepinephrine, this is a catecholamine. So catecholamines, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. Now, norepinephrine and epinephrine are considered excitatory. They're usually in the brain and your sympathetic nervous system. Your dopamine, serotonin, these are excitatory, also in the brain. Serotonin is involved in mood, emotions, and sleep. Dopamine can also be involved with your emotions or your mood. Histamine is involved in emotions, regulation of body temperature, and water balance. So besides the fact that it's a great vasodilator, right? It also is involved in emotions, regulation of body temperature, and water balance. GABA, that's inhibitory. Okay, so GABA has a lot to do with anxiety. If you have enough GABA, you're usually not anxious. So I'll say, hey, Fred Flintstone, GABA dabba doo, Fred Flintstone's relaxed. How about you? When you have enough GABA, it's inhibitory. It's going to relax you. Not enough will make you more anxious, more fearful. And then glycine, also inhibitory, and that's mostly found in the spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system, okay, includes your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system. They act in opposites of one another, and they do that to provide balance or homeostasis. The autonomic provides motor and sensory innervation to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, and you're usually not aware of it. The neuropathways in the motor fibers of the autonomic nervous system involve two neurons and a ganglion. Remember that ganglion is just a connection of cells or relay stations between the neurons. The preganglionic fiber is located in the brain or the spinal cord, and it synapses with the ganglion outside the sympathetic nervous system and also on the postganglionic fiber to those effector organs or tissues. Your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight. It will increase activity in the body, particularly the cardiovascular, respiratory, and neurological function. It's necessary for fight or flight or stress, and it's helped with increased secretions. So we know those increased secretions are going to be from that adrenal medulla, like the epinephrine, norepinephrine, the cortisol. All right, so these sympathetic nerves arise from the thoracic areas, the lumbar areas of the spinal cord. The ganglia are located, or these cells that are connected together are located on the chains or trunks on either side of the spinal cord. The neurotransmitters are released by the preganglionic fibers at the ganglion, so acetylcholine. Most sympathetic postganglionic fibers release epinephrine or norepinephrine. That's your adrenergic or your adrenaline. Norepinephrine acts mostly on alpha receptors and epinephrine on alpha beta receptors. So that's important when we're treating people for certain things, because those same receptors, alpha and beta receptors, are what we use for the blood pressure medications and to control heart rate in people that have problems with their heart rate. Your motor nerves are in the autonomic system that follow a two neuron arrangement. So you have preganglionic neurons that carry the signal out from the central nervous system. They transmit the impulse over to the ganglia, those cell bodies. And then the postganglionic neurons get the signal from the ganglia and take it out to the target area. So wherever we want that action to occur. Neurotransmitters are a group of chemical signaling molecules. They transmit the impulse from one fiber to the next. In the sympathetic nervous system, neurotransmitters can relay signals from preganglionic nerves to the ganglia to the postganglionic nerves and out to the target tissue. So these ganglia are really just the relay system that is being used to send that signal. Your preganglionic sympathetic fibers use acetylcholine. Most of your sympathetic nervous system postganglionic fibers release norepinephrine. And the postganglionic fibers, the sweat glands, the blood vessels, the skeletal muscles are cholinergic. The peripheral nervous system, this dominates the digestive system. We always talk about rest and digest. It helps the body recover after sympathetic activity. There's two major locations for parasympathetic nervous system preganglionic fibers. So we talked about these a second ago. Cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. You hear a lot about 10, okay? Because 10 is that vagus nerve. And so whenever that vagus nerve is innervated, what happens? It slows down the heart, it slows down the digestive system. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglia, remember, those are the little cell bodies that are relay systems. They're scattered, they're close to the target organs. The neurotransmitter at both preganglionic and postganglionic is acetylcholine. So here in parasympathetic, we have acetylcholine for preganglionic and postganglionic. Remember, on sympathetic, it was acetylcholine for preganglionic and norepinephrine for the postganglionic. There's two types of cholinergic receptors, nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic are always stimulated by acetylcholine, and they're in the postganglionic cholinergic neurons in both peripheral and sympathetic nervous system. And then muscarinic receptors, these are located on the effector cells. They can be stimulated or inhibited by acetylcholine, depending on what the organ is. So this slide here just kind of shows you how the stimulation occurs here. The target organ, okay? So in parasympathetic, all right, the soma is usually in the brainstem or the sacral area down towards the bottom of the spinal cord. We have a neurotransmitter released, acetylcholine, because it's parasympathetic. So remember, acetylcholine will be in the pre and the post. And then from the post, again, you'll have the acetylcholine released to help stimulate or inhibit that target organ. With sympathetic, usually the soma is in the spine, postganglionic neuron. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to switch that slide. Let me go back. In the pre-ganglionic, we're usually going to have acetylcholine, okay? And then the neurotransmitters released post-ganglionic are going to be norepinephrine, and that's going to activate that fight or flight. Where with parasympathetic, you have that rest or digest being activated there. And then, of course, because they act in opposites of each other, then we see different things. So with parasympathetic, we see constriction of the pupil, whereas with sympathetic, we have dilation. With parasympathetic, it's rest and digest, so we need that increase in the saliva. We need that increase in the motility. We need that pancreas and that gallbladder to be stimulated. With sympathetic nervous system, we need the bronchioles dilated. We need the saliva inhibited. We need the digestive system slowed down. So we have inhibition of the digestive system, inhibition of the pancreas and the gallbladder. We also have the urinary tract here for parasympathetic. So we're going to be able to urinate. We'll be able to move our bowels. Also, it's rest, digest, and reproduce. So if you notice parasympathetic, it's stimulating our genitals. So we can have that erection to reproduce. On sympathetic, okay, it's going to be more tension there. It will stimulate the orgasm here, but most of that stuff is going to be reduced, okay? Because we want inhibition there right now when we're in fight or flight. When we're in rest or digest, then we can relax. Okay, this, if you notice, stimulates the erection, whereas fight or flight stimulates the actual orgasm. So that's once you've already gotten that movement going on. All right, next we're going to just talk a little bit about neurological damage. So neurological damage can have different causes because of specific areas of the brain and the spinal cord being damaged. Damage to a certain area from a tumor or a head injury could result in the same type of neurological loss or signs depending on what area of the brain or the spinal cord is damaged there. So an infratentorial lesion is located in the brainstem or below the tentorium in the brain. A small lesion in the infratentorial area can cause motor and sensory impairment. It can be widespread impairment. It can affect the respiration, the circulation, the level of consciousness just by a small lesion in the infratentorial area. If it's supratentorial, it usually takes a pretty large lesion for us to see something. Local effects are specific to the area of the brain or the spinal cord where the lesion or the trauma occurs. Examples are like paresis or paralysis of the right arm. So you might have paresis or paralysis of the right arm that comes from damage to one section of the left frontal lobe. Or you could have a loss of vision because of damage to the occipital lobe. If you have an expanding lesion like a tumor, a hemorrhage, then we might see additional impairment in the adjacent area because that's becoming involved now. Supratentorial lesions occur in the cerebral hemispheres above the tentorian cerebelli. A lesion in that area causes specific dysfunction in a discrete area, like numbness in a hand. The lesion would have to be very large before it would affect consciousness. Infratentorial lesion is in the brainstem or below the tentorium. A small lesion in that area can affect motor and sensory fibers widespread, causing respiratory and circulation impairment, causing impairment to the level of consciousness. Damage to the left hemisphere causes a loss of logical thinking, analytical skills, intellectual abilities, and communication skills. Remember, Wernicke's and Broca is there. Right-sided brain damage will impair your appreciation of music and art, cause behavioral problems. It could lead to problems with spatial orientation or recognition of relationships. It can result with interference and mobility and neglect of the contralateral side of the body. So if you have a problem with the right side of the brain, you might neglect the left side of the body. Self-care deficits are common here. An individual may exhibit various levels of attention regarding the environment. One early change noted with acute brain disorders is a decreasing level of consciousness or responsiveness. Extensive supratentorial lesions may be present in the cerebral hemisphere that cause a loss of consciousness. Small lesions in the brainstem or infratentorial lesions can affect the reticular activating system. Various levels of reduced consciousness may produce as lethargy, confusion, disorientation, memory loss, unresponsiveness to verbal stimuli, or difficulty in arousal. So I would know that. If someone has a brain injury or brain damage, that's going to cause a decrease in the level of consciousness or responsiveness. It's going to cause a reduced level of consciousness, which can lead to things like confusion, memory loss, unresponsiveness, difficult arousal, loss of consciousness, the most serious stage, which would be a coma. In a coma, they don't respond to painful or verbal stimuli. The body is motionless. They might have some reflexes present. A deep coma is marked by loss of all reflexes, fixed and dilated pupils, slow and irregular pulse, and respiration. So we use the Glasgow Coma Scale. It can go up to 15. Usually once they get to about 12, they start to become what we consider pretty well brain damaged. So again, we're looking, are they able to open their eyes spontaneously? What does that mean? When you walk in the room, did they open their eyes or did you have to start talking to them? If you had to start talking to them to get them to open their eyes, then it goes to the second one, opens to verbal command or speech. If you had to stick a pin in the side of their leg to get them to respond, then it would go to opens to pain. Or if they have no response, no matter what you do, then it would be 1. Same thing with verbal. Did they, were they oriented when they responded? You asked them a question, they answered it appropriately. Now, you got to be careful when you're doing that because older people in the hospital, if their blood sugar or something like that drops, they might not necessarily know where they are. All right. But once you orient them to the time and place, are they still able to remain oriented? Confused conversation, but they're able to answer questions. Their words are not appropriate or their words are not understandable. Or they talk, but you can't understand any of it. And then motor, it'd be the same way. Okay, so you tell them to move something, or you put pain against them and they don't move. They should withdraw from the pain. abnormal posture. So this would be decorticate or decerebrate. Okay, abnormal, as you can see, if it's decorticate, that's the least of the two evils. Decerebrate is worse. All right, so decorticate is when their body is towards the core. In decerebrate, they're extended, their body goes away from the core. You should know these two definitions. Okay, in a vegetative state, they lose awareness and mental capacity. And this comes from diffuse brain damage. But the brain stem still works. So they're able to breathe, their heart still works, all that stuff still works. But they have no brain consciousness, okay? They're unaware of what's happening around them. With this, there appears to be a sleep-wake cycle. So sometimes their eyes are open, sometimes they're closed, but either way, they're unresponsive to any external stimuli. Locked-in syndrome is when they have brain damage and they're capable of thinking, but they can't move their body at all and they can't communicate. Some of them can move their eyes only. So that is locked-in syndrome. Know the difference between the two of them. You should also know this, the criteria for brain death. Okay. So we have to have cessation of brain function, including functioning of the cortex and the brainstem. This would be a flat or inactive EEG. Absence of the brainstem reflexes or responses. Absence of spontaneous respiration. So in this case, we would have to remove the ventilator and they don't start breathing on their own. Establishment of irreversible brain damage by the confirmation of the dysfunction, and usually requires two doctors to say that this isn't hypothyroidism, they're not too cold, they're not a drug overdose. This is not reversible, whatever's happening here. So if we had damage to the upper motor neurons in the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex or to the cortical spinal tract, remember that carries the descending movement or that signal out to control those voluntary movement, then that could cause weakness or paralysis on the opposite side of the body. So the area affected, like the leg or the arm, may have a decrease in the muscle tone or an increase in the reflexes, okay, because the spinal cord, if it's intact, may continue to conduct the impulses, but they still can't use it because it's not conducting those impulses correctly. So they might call that spastic paralysis. This leads to immobility and contractures in the affected limb. Damage to the lower motor neurons would cause weakness or paralysis on the same side of the body at or below the level of damage. So damage to the lower motor neuron in the spinal cord would cause weakness or paralysis on the same side of that body. In the area of damage, the muscles are usually going to be flaccid, absent of tone, absent flaccid paralysis, or if the damage on the cord is if the cord distal to the damage is intact, some of the reflexes in that area might be present, and you might see hyperreflexia. Motor neurons are located in the nuclei of the cranial nerves in the brainstem, and similarly, ipsilateral weakness or flaccid paralysis can result from damage to any cranial nerves that contain those motor fibers. Two involuntary motor responses that occur in people with severe brain trauma are decorticate and decerebrate posturing. Those are the two postures we just talked about. Both indicate severe brain damage. Remember, decorticate is not as bad as decerebrate. Decorticate includes rigid flexion in the upper arms, adducted arms, and internal rotation of the hands. The lower limbs are extended towards the core. Decerebrate responses occur in persons with brainstem lesions, central nervous system depression caused by systemic effects. Both the upper and lower limbs are extended as the head and the body is arched. So if you look up at top, A is decorticate and B is decerebrate. C is decorticate. D is opstonic, which in opstonic, they'll have like a little arch. As you can see, the one on the bottom has a little arch in his back and in his legs. Babies will also present with like an arch in their back. Sensory loss involves touch, pain, temperature, position, and special senses of vision, hearing, taste, and smell. The somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe receives and localizes sensory input from the body. It's mapped to corresponding receptors in the skin, the skeletal muscles, and certain body regions. Mapping of the dermatomes helps evaluate spinal cord lesions. Damage to the cranial nerves or the nuclei or the assigned area of the brain can interfere with vision or other special senses. Visual loss, this is called hemaniopia. And because of the unique anatomy of the visual pathways, loss of the visual field depends on the site of damage or the visual pathways. At the optic chiasm, the fibers in each of the optic nerves come together and divide. If the optic chiasm is totally destroyed, we can lose vision in both eyes. Partial loss can result in a variety of effects depending on particular fibers damaged, the optic coursing from the optic chiasm to the occipital lobe on one side includes fibers from each half of the eye. If the optic tract or occipital lobe is damaged, vision is lost from the medial half of one eye on the lateral half of the other eye. This is called hominis hemaniopia. The effect is loss of the visual field on the opposite side of the damage. Damage to the left occipital lobe means loss of the right visual field. I would know this. They like to ask about this. So this is called hemaniopia. All right. And we have loss on one side of the visual field that will affect the opposite side. So if you have damage to the left occipital lobe, you lose the right visual field. And it usually will happen on the same side on both eyes. So like if it happens on the lateral side of one eye, it's going to happen on the lateral side of the other eye. You can have other types of visual loss depending on the point of damage. Partial loss of vision can lead to an inability to coordinate input from the right and left visual fields. This can lead to diplopia, double vision, loss of depth perception, and eye-hand coordination. All right, next is language. So aphasia, you have to know this terminology. Aphasia is the inability to comprehend or express language. Dysphagia refers to partial impairment, which is more common. Expressive aphasia is impaired ability to speak or write fluently. Expressive aphasia occurs when the Broca area is damaged. Receptive or sensory aphasia is inability to read or understand spoken word. Here we have damage to the Wernicke area. And global aphasia is a combination of expressive and receptive that results from major damage to the brain, including both Broca and Wernicke area. Aphasia can also be described as fluent or non-fluent. In fluent aphasia, the pace of speech is normal, but the speech itself contains made-up words and sentences that don't make sense. Fluent aphasia is associated with damage to Wernicke's area. Non-fluent aphasia is slow labored speech with short phrases where small words are often omitted. It's associated with damage to the Broca area. Dysarthria is when the words cannot be articulated clearly. This comes from cranial nerve damage or muscle impairment. So usually we'll see dysarthria in people that have like ALS, Lou Gehrig's syndrome. You have to know the difference between these. So I would know them. Any questions on any of that? Okay, we also went over global aphasia and we all went over fluent and non-fluent. Any questions on any of that? Dysarthria, this is where the words cannot be articulated well. Agraphia and alexia, I really don't see him asking a lot about that, but agraphia is impaired writing ability. Alexia is impaired reading ability. So dyslexia, right, is where they read, everything looks backwards. So think about that. Agnosia is when we don't recognize or associate. So agnosia is when, let's say you give your client a toothbrush and they start brushing their hair with it because they don't know. They forgot. They don't remember that it's for their teeth. So you'll see this a lot of times with your clients with dementia. I would know agnosia. I would know dysarthria. I give my client a comb and she tries to brush her teeth with it. I give her a remote control. She tries to eat it. That's agnosia. They don't recognize. Seizures or convulsions. What do you need to know about these? Mostly that they're caused by excessive discharge by neurons in the brain. Things like inflammation, lack of oxygen, bleeding in the brain can lead to them. Tumors. Sometimes this is the first sign of a brain tumor. If it's focal, it's going to be related to irritation at that site. It can become generalized. We'll see involuntary repetitive movement, abnormal sensations. Involuntary repetitive movement or picking, skin picking, picking at the clothes, a smell, a taste. These are called an aura, and they typically happen right before the seizure. So a lot of times people can tell you they're going to have a seizure because of that aura. Depending on the type of seizure, they could have confusion, staring, uncontrollable jerking, loss of consciousness, loss of bowel and bladder, loss of cognitive. Generalized means it involves all areas of the brain. Absence. Usually, when someone has an absence seizure, they'll just stare into space. Tonic-clonic. These used to be called grand mal. This is the most dramatic. They're going to have jerking, stiffening, shaking, possible consciousness loss, possible bladder loss. Myoclonic is just going to be a little bit of jerking and no loss of consciousness. And then partial and focal are the same. They only involve one part of the brain. So usually they'll have twitching or strained sensation, but no loss of consciousness. Status epilepticus is back-to-back seizures, or when the seizure lasts longer than 5 minutes. That's life-threatening. Okay, so generalized, all areas of the brain, absence, staring into space. Tonic clonic is drama, loss of consciousness, loss of urine, loss of oxygen, shaking, jerking. Partial or focal, that's one part of the brain. Status epilepticus, life-threatening. Any questions on that? Increased cranial pressure. So your brain is in a rigid bone. The fluid, the blood, the cerebral spinal fluid that's in there is what needs to be in there. Any more is going to cause a problem. So if you have too much fluid in the brain, if you have a tumor or anything else in the brain that doesn't belong there, it's going to cause a problem. All right. You can either have ischemia or a brain bleed from a stroke. If you have the brain bleed, that of course would increase the pressure. If you had ischemia, that could cause changes in the pressure because you're not getting blood flow to the brain. Remember, you don't have any backup oxygen and nutrients there. So your body is going to respond to changes in your chemoreceptors, right? And in those carotid arteries because the brain's not getting blood and is going to try to put it back in homeostasis, which can actually cause a problem here. Things that cause increased cranial pressure, hemorrhages, trauma, edema in the brain, cerebral edema, infections, tumors, or a problem with your cerebral spinal fluid circulation. Again, if you have too much fluid, too much pressure in the brain, it can push down on the brain stem. It can push down on the brain stem and cause it to herniate. What would we see? You have to know this. Okay. Increased cranial pressure. We're going to see a decreasing level of consciousness. Remember, at the brainstem is your reticular activating system. Pressure there is going to decrease your level of awareness or consciousness. The meninges or the walls of the blood vessels are going to start to stretch. That's going to cause a headache. Pressure, again, too much fluid pressing down on your medulla oblongata where your emesis center is, and that's going to cause you to vomit. Cushing's reflex. This is because the brain is not getting enough oxygen here. Okay. We have cerebral ischemia. That causes the body to vasoconstrict, right? Because your carotid arteries, your chemoreceptors are sensing a change. And so they're going to cause vasoconstriction because they want to get more blood into the brain. They don't realize that's only going to make it worse. But it recognizes we have low flow in the brain, not enough oxygen in the brain. So the body tries to fix it by increasing the blood pressure to the brain. And that's going to cause the heart rate to slow down. It can also cause papilla edema, so swollen optic disc, okay, because of the increased pressure of that cerebral spinal fluid. And the pupils can eventually become fixed and dilated. And that's from pressure on cranial nerve 3, again, from this extra fluid in the brain. When ICP increases, the body will try to compensate and shift more cerebral spinal fluid to the spinal cavity, increase the venous return from the brain. That causes hypoxia, vasodilation, and the body is going to try to improve the blood supply to the brain. That's going to increase the volume in the skull, and that is going to cause the signs of ICP. First indication is a decreasing level of consciousness. You have to know this. Additional signs: severe headache, vomiting, and it's usually projectile. This is the only time when you'll see projectile vomiting that is not associated with food. Papilla edema, because of increased intracranial pressure and swelling of the optic disc. Okay, we can see this by looking through one of those optic scopes. And that's what it's going to look like. If the ICP continues, then we'll see a series of events. We really call this Cushing's triad. All right, but you'll have cerebral ischemia from the Cushing's reflex. That's what I just described, where your brain's not getting enough oxygen. So your body's going to try to increase the blood flow to the brain, the arterial supply. All right, it's going to increase the blood pressure, bring more blood to the brain because of the ischemia going on there. That's only going to make it worse. Because of this happening, it's also going to slow down the heart rate. So Cushing's triad is going to be increase in the systolic pressure, a decrease in the heart rate, increase in that pulse pressure, a change in respirations here. The chemoreceptors respond to the low carbon dioxide and reduce the respiratory rate. The cerebral circulation relieves the ischemia, so the vasoconstriction reflex momentarily stops. But because the increasing ICP causes more ischemia now, okay, the cycle's just going to be repeated. So as the brain responds to the ischemia, all right, the control for the blood pressure uses other mechanisms to try to protect the rest of the body. And that's kind of a conflict there in the body. It doesn't really know what to do there. The ICP continues to rise. So does the systemic blood pressure, and increase in the pulse pressure. That's the difference between the systolic and the diastolic. This should usually be around 40, 30 to 40, but we'll see a wide gap there in that pressure. So systolic goes up, diastolic is going to kind of stay the same. And this is because of Cushing's reflex. You have to know that. All right, so what are we usually going to see? Respirations down and irregular, blood pressure up, heart rate down. Pressure on the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, is going to cause the response of the pupils. So eventually the pupils will become fixed and dilated if the pressure continues. As the pressure increases, we'll have a shift of contents. Both pupils become fixed and dilated. Droopy eyelids may occur. They can develop nystagmus here. Lumbar puncture might be done here. So we'll look at the pressure. The pressure should not be greater than 20. Usually we keep it between 10 and 20. The fluid should be clear. Remember, if it's cloudy or anything like that, that's cerebrospinal fluid, then we have a problem. If there's pink color or red blood cells in the cerebrospinal fluid, it could indicate a hemorrhage. If there's protein in the spinal fluid, it could indicate a tumor, a brain tumor. If a mass like a blood clot or a tumor becomes enlarged, it can displace the brain tissue and cause herniation. So in a transtentorial herniation, the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, and the midbrain are displaced downward, affecting the flow of blood and cerebrospinal fluid, the reticular activating system, and respirations. An uncal herniation, when the temporal lobe is displaced downward, and that creates pressure on the third cranial nerve. the posterior cerebral artery, and the reticular activating system. So it's never going to be good because of the pressure in the brain. So this is why brain tumor doesn't have to be malignant to kill you. The pressure alone from the expanding tumor, from the displacement of things in the brain, can actually be as dangerous as a malignant tumor itself. So eventually the cerebellar or tonsillar herniation occurs when the cerebellar tonsils are pushed down through the foramen magnum, and that compresses the brain, the stem, and the vital centers. So it gets pushed down through that little hole there, or that notch there, and causes damage. Remember, L3, L4 is usually where we're going to take that spinal fluid from, that lumbar puncture, and it's painful. All right, tumors, these are a good example of space occupying lesions. They can increase the intracranial pressure because there's no room for them to grow. Benign ones can be life threatening unless they're in an area where we can easily access them and remove them. Gliomas form the largest category of malignant tumors, and they come from the glial cells. This group of tumors can be defined into further cells like astrocytomas. These are the most common, and by where they're located at. So main thing is remember that the tumors take up space in the brain. They don't have to be malignant in order to kill someone because they're taking up that space. Tumors that develop in the meninges or pituitary gland will cause neurological effects from pressure on the brain. Malignant tumors rarely metastasize outside of the central nervous system, but multiple tumors can occur in the central nervous system. Secondary brain tumors are common, metastasizing from breast or lung tumors. These can cause effects similar to primary brain tumors. So primary malignant brain tumors have no well-defined margins. They're invasive. They will grow into the adjacent tissue. They're hard to remove, and there's usually inflammation around the tumor. Most of them come from astrocytomas, and they're invasive. But remember, again, they don't have to be invasive in order to kill because they're taking up space in the brain. A small tumor in a brainstem or cerebellum can compress the medulla in a short time. Tumors in cerebral hemispheres are usually going to grow without obvious function, so they can grow a lot or big before we start to actually notice them. This is your astrocytoma. This develops in the central nervous system, usually in the brain. These can be benign or malignant, and they're glial cells. Brainstem and cerebellar tumors are common in young children. They continue to do research to determine where they come from, whether it's carcinogen exposure or they develop during utero. Tumors in most adults are in the midlife time when they occur, and they're usually going to be in the cerebral hemispheres. The site of the tumor depends on focal signs. Sometimes focal or generalized seizures are the first sign of the brain tumor. That's probably a test question. If the tumor grows rapidly, then we'll see that increased cranial pressure. That often starts with morning headaches. Headaches will increase in severity, vomiting, lethargy, irritability, personality changes. If it's on the brainstem or the cerebellar, it can cause facial paralysis or vision problems. Again, focalized or generalized seizures are usually the first sign of these brain tumors or early morning headache. All right, you can have vascular disorders. These can be hemorrhagic or ischemic. So hemorrhagic would be from a bleed. Ischemic would be from a blockage. A global cerebral ischemia can cause things like shock or cardiac arrest because of perfusion issues. It can also lead to confusion, neurological issues, temporary or permanent. A TIA, you have to know the difference between a TIA and a stroke. Okay, TIA is a temporary reduction in blood flow to the brain. Usually they recover in 24 hours. These can be a one-time deal or they can happen in a series. Here we have partial occlusion of an artery. This can be from atherosclerosis, vascular spasms, because those reduce the blood flow, or loss of autoregulation. TIAs are considered a warning sign for a stroke or a CVA. Remember that the brain has to have a constant source of glucose and oxygen. But not all strokes are preceded by TIAs. Signs and symptoms for the TIA, usually directly related to the location of where the ischemia occurred. But with the TIA, they'll usually stay conscious, intermittent short episodes of impaired function like muscle weakness in the arm or the leg, visual disturbances, numbness or paresthesia in the face. Transient aphasia or confusion usually lasts a few minutes, rarely longer than 1 to 2 hours. Symptoms will disappear. Repeated attacks are a warning sign of obstruction related to atherosclerosis. Okay, this is the actual stroke. So the CVA is an infarction of the brain tissue that results from a lack of blood. It can either be occlusion of the cerebral blood vessel or rupture of the blood vessel. 5 minutes of ischemia causes irreversible damage. All function can be lost. We'll have an area of inflammation. Sometimes that area can regain function once it heals. A stroke, again, infarction of the brain tissue from lack of blood. Either a rupture, so a bleed, a hemorrhagic stroke, or a ischemia, a blockage. And the blockage is mostly by an atheroma, which comes from atherosclerosis. So it's this piece of plaque that breaks off, or a blood clot. 5 minutes or less of ischemia, again, irreversible damage. So this is just showing you what the brain looks like once the infarction occurs. You can have strokes from a lack of blood. That's going to be ischemic, or by the ruptured vessel. That's hemorrhagic. Both of them are considered major causes of disability. Atheromas develop in large arteries like the carotid, causing narrowing of the artery by plaque, and that plaque can break off. All right. Or it can stay there and just keep getting stuff added to it, like blood clotting and sticking to it. And that can cause an infarction or block the whole vessel. A sudden obstruction caused by an embolus, enlarging in a cerebral artery, is the second type of stroke. Emboli can come from other materials like tumors, air, or infection. So we have the atheroma, which is the plaque. We have the obstruction of the embolus. We have intracerebral hemorrhage, which is caused by rupture of a cerebral artery, usually like from high blood pressure. So the vessels are supposed to expand and contract, but over time, when you constantly have high blood pressure, it wears the vessel out, or high blood sugar. Both of those can damage that vessel and wear it out. Hemorrhagic strokes are more severe. They affect a larger part of the brain. There's a greater increase in intracranial pressure with the hemorrhage. So damage is going to be evident in both hemispheres, complicated by the effects of the bleeding, the disruption in the blood supply. Free blood in the area there is going to cause irritation to the cell membranes. It can also cause additional damage, like vasospasms, electrolyte imbalances, acidosis, edema. We can look at an MRI. Okay, causes of strokes can be diabetes, high blood pressure, systemic lupus erythematosus, atherosclerosis, one of the main causes. History of TIAs, increases in age, smoking, obstructive sleep, sedentary lifestyles, heart issues, oral contraceptives, estrogen mainly, cigarette smoking, vasoconstriction, and then congenital formation of blood vessels and increasing age. So, what do we want to look for? Things like sudden transit weakness, tingling in the face, the arms, or on one side of the body, temporary losses of speech or confusion, sudden loss of vision, sudden severe headache, dizziness, unsteadiness. Depending on the location, okay, what kind of symptoms are we going to see? So, silent areas of the brain, we might not see any change. Obstruction of small arteries may not lead to obvious signs until we have several infarctions. But they could have flaccid paralysis, which could end up turning into spastic paralysis. In the first 48 hours, it'll be based on the inflammation, the site. Sometimes they can be protected with something called collateral circulation. And you can develop this from exercise and good habits where your vessels around you will help the blood flow, the vessels around the area that was infarcted or hemorrhaged. There's other little vessels that you develop that can help with that blood flow around that area if you exercise and you take good care of yourself. Other things we would see are lack of voluntary movement on the opposite side of the body. And then we could use the National Stroke Scale to look at it. You guys are going to be taking that course at some point because I make everybody in the school take it. Emergency first aid would be call 911, get them to the hospital right away. If we do get them there in a certain amount of time, we might be able to do something for them. Cerebral aneurysms, these are caused by localized weakness in the wall of the artery, usually at the points of bifurcation. So we talked about the circle of Willis. It can happen there where the arteries come together and the artery can actually bulge out. That's called a Berry aneurysm, where it bulges out. It doesn't actually rupture. It can be aggravated by hypertension. So we can have the hypertension that can cause the Berry aneurysm. It could actually rupture if we continue to aggravate that area. Sometimes they're small, they're asymptomatic. A slow bleed can cause certain types of vascular headaches. The rupture can cause a sudden fatal increase in increased cranial pressure and death. Blood can be irritating here. It can cause irritation, inflammatory response. The blood can also cause vasospasms in the artery, reducing the perfusion, leading to additional areas of ischemia. Hemorrhage from the ruptured vessels, again, can cause increased cranial pressure and death. Usually they'll have a really devastating headache when that happens. Again, it can also lead to tension with, increase in that blood or the mass on the meninges. So we can see headaches, photophobia, which is sensitivity to light, dysfunction like confusion, slurred speech, weakness, nuchorigidity, or a stiff neck. Again, if those meninges are inflamed. They could also have a massive rupture or subarachnoid hemorrhage. Here they would have a severe blinding headache. Right before that subarachnoid hemorrhage or that massive rupture, and that could lead to death. So with the aneurysm, it's usually hope that we diagnose it before the rupture, and we try to keep that blood pressure down, try to keep those blood sugars in control, okay, so that we don't have issues with these clients once we know about it. Sometimes people ignore, so by the time they get to us, it's too late. This is just, if you look at that big dark circle, that's the Barry aneurysm. Okay, so it develops there. It's not ruptured, it develops this like bubble. So, what kind of symptoms will we see with the stroke? Loss of the visual field or disturbances, headache, photophobia, periods of dysfunction that come and go, nuchal rigidity by the irritation of the meninges, vomiting, seizures, loss of consciousness. This might happen in a rupture. Again, nuchal rigidity from the blood irritating there. You can also develop infections, meningitis, encephalitis. So, meningitis is usually caused by a virus, bacteria, or sometimes a fungus in the meninges of the central nervous system. All groups are susceptible, but we'll a lot of times see this in school or colleges because we have a lot of people close together and it spreads through the droplets. So people sneezing, it's in that respiratory tract and those respiratory droplets, and they're sneezing and coughing around each other and spreading it. It binds to the nasopharyngeal cells, crosses the mucosal barrier, and then attaches to the choroid plexus. Remember, the choroid plexus, the third and fourth ventricles, is where the cerebral spinal fluid is produced. So it enters that cerebral spinal fluid, which is then going to go in that subarachnoid space and spread it throughout the brain. Epidemics common in schools or institutions with close contact, spread by respiratory in children and young adults. Neisseria meningititis is the most common, and it's carried in that nose in respiratory droplets. Usually we treat people that are close contact prophylactically because of that. So most of your meningitis is going to be bacterial in origin. It causes a purulent exudate to cover the surface of the brain. The exudate is in the cerebral spinal fluid. It's in the blood vessels on the surface of the brain, and it dilates them. It can be secondary to other infections like sinusitis or otitis because when they sneeze, the bacteria pushes to the back of the mouth, the nasopharyngeal area there. It can come from an abscessed tooth. Aseptic or viral meningitis can come from an infection like mumps or measles. And Nursera just had aseptic meningitis from a bug bite she got in her garden and almost died from it. So these microorganisms get to the brain through the blood or nearby tissue or direct access. The membranes are continuous around the central nervous system, the cerebral spinal fluid in that subarachnoid space, allowing the infection to spread quickly through the covering of the brain. Focal signs are absent because there's no localized mass of infection. The inflammatory response to the infection causes increased cranial pressure. The pia and the arachnoid layers become edematous. Exudate is in the cerebral spinal fluid, and the blood vessels on the surface of the brain become dilated. Other symptoms you'll see a petechial rash, especially with babies. I would know that. This is just showing you the bacteria. It's mostly bacterial. So with babies, E. coli. And we'll see this a lot in babies that have neural tube defects because Sometimes they have an open area on the back there of the spinal cord, and the E. coli can migrate into that area during diaper changes or when they have like explosive diarrhea. In young children, caused by Haemophilus influenza. Remember, the flu is in the autumn or the winter usually. Children and young adults, Neisseria meningitidis, and older adults, it's going to be Streptococcus pneumoniae. Symptoms: sudden onset, severe headache, back pain, phobophonia, mucorigidity, stiff neck. Koenig's sign. So remember, I said they can have pain when they extend their leg and flex their hip, or when they flex their neck, it causes flexion of the hip and the knee. And this is because of that spinal cord going from the meninges all the way down, and it's inflamed and rigid at the moment. So that's Koenig's sign and Brzezinski's sign. I'll show you that on the next page. Vomiting, irritability, lethargy. Remember, that's up in the brain. That brain stem is being affected there. Leukocytosis. Then they can progress to stupor or seizures. So they're going towards that comatose stage. There's your Koenig's sign. The knee extension is painful. Koenig's for knee. And Brzezinski, where knee flexion, where neck flexion, leads to knee flexion. I would know those. So we're going to do a lumbar puncture there and look at the spinal fluid. Brain abscesses, these are usually localized infections. They can happen frequently in the frontal or the temporal lobe. Remember, that's a pus pocket there on solid tissue. We have necrosis of the brain tissue, edema. This can be from organisms spreading from the ear, the throat, the lung, sinus infections. It can come from bacterial endocarditis. So it's going to cause neurological issues, increasing ICP. It can cause common organisms are going to be staph, strep, and pneumonia. The onset of a brain abscess, this can be slow or insidious. It's a localized infection. Usually occurs in the frontal or the temporal lobes. It causes necrosis and edema. Encephalitis. This is usually from a bug, a tick, a virus. So herpes can cause this. Encephalitis is infection of the parenchymal or connective tissue. The basal ganglia, remember that's your movement. Infection can include the meninges, the necrosis, and inflammation develop in the brain. This can cause permanent damage. Usually this person's going to have a headache, stiff neck, lethargy, vomiting, seizures, and fever. It's usually viral. That's your big clue. Remember that meningitis is usually bacterial. This is usually viral. Western equine encephalitis. Okay. This is an arboviral. Western equine is arboviral. I call this my Disney World because it happens mostly in the summer. It's going to happen in those warm areas like where Disney World is. Common in young kids at Disney World. St. Louis encephalitis, they don't ask about this a lot. And the only thing your book really says about it is it's in older people. So again, it's going to come from some sort of mosquito or something along that lines, or, virus. West Nile, this is Flava Flava. He's the rapper, Flava Flava, North Jersey virus. So West Nile, a lot of this in New Jersey, caused by the flavivirus. It's spread by mosquitoes and a bird. Okay. Flu-like symptoms, low-grade fever, headache. Neuroborreliosis. This is Lyme's disease caused by Barilla burgdorferi, transmitted by ticks, and the classic sign is that bullseye. It's going to also cause joint issues, and this can cause cardiac issues as well. So Lyme's disease, remember the cause, ticks, bullseye. Herpes simplex encephalitis. This comes from herpes 1. And here we can have necrosis and hemorrhage in the brain. Remember that herpes lives in that trigeminal nerve ganglion. Amoebic meningoencephalitis. This is caused by the amoeba Naegleria fowleri. This is that one that we talked about the other day, happening a couple times in the United States this summer. It's usually pretty rare. Lives in that warm water. I talked about the ponds down south where people bathe at and stuff. All right. But this happened also in Minnesota this year, and the kid contracted it. The amoeba gets in the brain. It causes inflammation and swelling of the brain and the spinal cord. And yes, they died. Rabies. This is transmitted by animals. These animals a lot of times come out in the daytime when they're nighttime animals. That's how you know they're rabid. They'll come around people when they don't normally come around people. They'll be foaming at the mouth. Okay, this one attacks the central nervous system. It causes inflammation and necrosis in the brain stem. This one, we're going to see headache. It causes problems with the salivary glands. So that's where you're going to see the difficulty swallowing, muscle spasms, foaming at the mouth, and they die from respiratory failure. Tetanus, a little bit different. This causes lockjaw. Remember, it comes from those endospores in the soil. Enters that foot, goes deep in the tissue. So this is going to cause jaw stiffness, difficulty swallowing, stiff neck, headache, muscle spasms. Again, it can cause respiratory failure. Poliomyelitis. This is the polio virus. There are immunizations available. It is highly contagious. There are people that can spread it through direct contact and oral droplets. It attacks the motor neurons of the spinal cord, the medulla oblongata. It can lead to fever, headache, vomiting, stiff neck. And they keep this on tap for chemical warfare. Herpes zoster virus. This is varicella. So this can come back. All right. It affects the cranial nerves. Remember, one dermatome, meaning it's on one nerve line. It can cause pain, paresthesia, that rash. The rash is when it's infective, when you have that vesicular rash. It can be very painful. It can cause post-herpetic pain for years. Post-polio syndrome. This can happen to people that had the original polio infection. And it's progressive, debilitating, causes muscle atrophy. Also, the more severe the original infection, the more severe the side effects of post-polio are going to be. Next one is Reyes syndrome. I would know this one. This is from giving kids with the virus infection aspirin, usually young kids. So usually your book says below the age of 5. You'll see questions that test on this up until about 8 years old, sometimes even 12. But it's any kid who gets aspirin after a virus infection is at risk for this. Okay? It causes changes in the brain and the liver, cerebral edema, enlarged fatty liver, renal failure, no cure. Guillain-Barré, this is also expected to come from a virus. So either post-infection polyneuritis, acute idiopathic polyneuropathy, some sort of virus here. It causes inflammation of the peripheral nervous system, inflammation, demyelination. Now, demyelination is going to mean that we're taking that myelin sheath away. So remember, I said Guillain-Barré, multiple sclerosis. This is going to affect the nerve conduction because that myelin sheath helps that neuron conduction. The axons, if they're destroyed, they could be recreated, but the neuron can't. But the axon helps with that nerve conduction. So here we have changes in both of those, which are going to affect nerve conduction, mostly in the legs here. So in Guillain-Barré, it usually starts at the legs and it'll work its way all the way up to the spinal nerves, the trunk, the neck. Eventually, this is going to cause them a problem with breathing. They're going to end up on a ventilator probably. Okay, so it starts when the ascending paralysis starts to involve the diaphragm, the respiratory muscles, and then it'll start to reverse itself, okay? They can start to recover here. Brain injuries, a lot of times these will involve skull fractures. This can lead to hemorrhage and edema in the brain. It can also cause swelling in the brain, so it can lead to increased cranial pressure. We can have a direct injury. It could be mild or just bruising the brain, or it could be severe and life-threatening if it causes destruction of the tissue or causes massive swelling. Remember that the skull protects the brain, but if it's damaged, it can cause bone fragments to penetrate the brain tissue. So there's different types. You have a concussion. You should know the difference between these. Concussion is when we have reversible interference with the brain function. It causes a temporary but sudden excessive movement of the brain. This causes a little bit of disruption in the function. It could lead to loss of consciousness. We have amnesia or memory loss. This can happen after a concussion. Usually they'll recover with no permanent brain damage within 24 hours. Recurrent concussions like those suffered by boxers, though, can cause progressive permanent brain damage. And then a contusion, this is when we bruise the brain tissue. You can have a closed head injury when the skull is not fractured, but the brain tissue is injured and the blood vessels are ruptured. Open head injuries where you have a fracture to the actual skull. A depressed skull fracture, this is when a piece of the bone is displaced below the level of the skull. So like something dropped on your head and pushed it down in. It's compressing the brain tissue. It can impair blood supply to the area. Basilar fracture, I would know this. This happens at the base of the skull. Here we'll have spinal fluid leaking through the ears or the nose. So remember, we're going to test it for glucose. If we put a 4x4 there, we can see that little halo. This can happen when the forehead hits the windshield. You can also have contracoup. This we see in shaken baby syndrome, or when you hit your head on the front of the car and then you bounce back, the head goes back and forth, bouncing off the skull. This can be secondary to an acceleration or deceleration injury. So that's showing you how that rebounds there. The depressed, where it pushes the bone down into the tissue. You can have primary brain injuries. These are direct injuries like lacerations or crushing of the neuron, glial cells, and blood vessels in the brain. They usually involve a laceration or compression of the brain tissue by some sort of bone or foreign object. The application of the unusual force can cause the brain to rotate or shift in the skull, and that can cause damage, like a shearing injury. Secondary brain damage is usually caused by development of additional injurious factors, like secondary from the additional effects of the cerebral edema, the hemorrhage, the hematoma, the vasospasm, the infection, or the ischemia. You need to know the difference there. All right, so we have trauma to the brain tissue that causes a loss of function in the body part that's controlled by that part of the brain. Cell damage and bleeding causes inflammation or vasospasms at the site of the injury. This can lead to increased cranial pressure, ischemia, and additional dysfunction. The central area of damage undergoes necrosis and is usually replaced by scar tissue or a cyst. You can have a hematoma where you have a collection of blood in the tissue. This can come from ruptured blood vessels. It can also develop after surgery, and they're usually classified by where they're located in regards to the meninges. So it could be an extradural or epidural hematoma where the blood fills the space between the dura and the bone. It could be subdural, where the blood fills the space between the dura and the arachnoid space, or it could be intracerebral. Epidural is bleeding between the dura and the skull, usually caused by tearing of the middle meningeal artery in the temporal region. With epidural hematoma, they can lose consciousness. Subdural hematoma between the dura and the arachnoid, usually a small tear in the vein, causes blood to accumulate slowly there. A hematoma that can develop after surgical procedure. A chronic subdural hematoma, we see these in older adults. A tear in the arachnoid, which can cause the cerebral spinal fluid to leak. In any kind of hematoma, the bleeding leads to local pressure on the adjacent tissue. This causes increases in the intracranial pressure. With hematoma, it could disintegrate about 7 days after it develops, but that can cause the cells to undergo hemolysis, and it can change the pressure there, the osmotic pressure, and cause increased cranial pressure because of it. Subarachnoid hemorrhage that occurs between the arachnoid and the pia. This is usually associated with traumatic bleeding from blood vessels at the base of the brain. You can have an intracerebral hematoma. This usually comes from contusions or a shearing injury, and it can happen several days after the injury occurs. All types of hematoma cause local pressure on the adjacent tissue. They all lead to increased cranial pressure. This can be caused by a sports injury, an accident, falls. Mostly we see these in the older people, but it can happen in any age group. Signs and symptoms of hematoma are going to be local pressure or adjacent tissue swelling, causing an increase in intracranial pressure. They might have focal signs or general signs of increased cranial pressure. Seizures would be the focal signs, but they're going to be more generalized, and that's because of the blood irritating the area. We can have cranial nerve impairment, especially if someone has a basilar fracture. So that can cause the leaking of the cerebral spinal fluid from the ear or the nose. If it allows the fluid to pass out of the subarachnoid space, that can allow bacteria to enter the brain. It can cause the hypothalamus to be impaired. We also have spinal cord injuries. These can come from fractures dislocation of the vertebrae. This causes compression, stretching, or tearing of the spinal cord. Spinal cord injuries can come from hyperextension or hyperflexion of the neck. Damage to the disc and the ligaments occur here. This can cause dislocation, loss of alignment. Dislocation of the vertebrae can crush or compress the spinal cord and compromise the blood supply. Compression fractures cause injury to the spinal cord if we have great force applied to the top of the skull. So, like if you dove off of a diving board into an empty pool, or even off of like a railroad trestle into a river and you hit a sandbar. If you jump from a certain height and landed on your feet, the shattered bone and the spinal cord there is compressed, and it will put pressure against the cord. The sharp edges of the bone fragment can lacerate or tear the nerve fibers there and the blood vessels. Spinal cord damage can also come from penetration injuries like a stab or a bullet wound. So this is just showing you dislocation of the vertebrae, how it can crush or compress the spinal cord and compromise the blood supply. Or hyperextension can also cause damage or compression. Compression fractures, these can cause injury to the spinal cord when great force is applied to the top of the skull, or if you were to jump from like a 40-foot building and land on your feet. Vertebral fractures can be classified as simple, meaning they're a single line break. Compression, where we have crushed or shattered bone in multiple fragments. I would know that. A wedge fracture, where we have a displaced angular section of the bone, and a dislocation where it's forced out of its normal position. So I would definitely know compression and dislocation. Spinal cord injuries are unstable, so we need to stabilize and immobilize these clients immediately so we don't incur additional damage or secondary damage. Damage to the spinal cord can be temporary or permanent. The nerves in the spinal cord do not undergo mitosis, but their axons can regrow. Laceration of the nerve tissue by bone fragments usually causes a permanent loss of conduction in that affected nerve tract. Complete transection or severing or crushing of the spinal cord can cause irreversible loss of all sensory and motor function at or below the level of injury. Partial transection or crushing injuries can allow recovery of some of the functions. You also have bruising, which can be reversible damage and mild edema and temporarily impair conduction of some of the impulses. Compression of the cord, which must be relieved quickly to maintain blood supply. Prolonged ischemia or necrosis cause permanent damage to the spinal cord. Bleeding and inflammation can cause additional pressure and interfere with blood flow. Edema and hemorrhage can extend to areas below and above the level of injury. Damaged tissue also causes things to be released: norepinephrine, serotonin, and histamine. This can cause vasoconstriction, local ischemia, and necrosis. Destructive enzymes are also released, which can lead to inflammation and necrosis. Loss of function may look to be extensive at first, but as the edema subsides, sometimes recovery or that function can reappear, that it can start to work again if the edema goes down. So sometimes while we're edematous, it won't work, but as we recover, it does. Regular assessment and movement of sensory responses using the dermatome map can determine the degree of damage. So remember, that dermatome map can show us where that damage is. When injury occurs in the cervical region, inflammation may extend upward to the level of C3, C5, interfering with phrenic nerve innervation to the diaphragm and affecting respiration. So these people may need a ventilator. Spinal shock, you have to know this. In the initial period after the injury, conduction of impulses will stop to the nerve tracts and in the gray matter. This is called spinal shock. The extent of the injury, the amount of bleeding, and the need for surgical intervention determine the rate and degree of recovery. Inflammation will gradually subside. The phagocytes will remove the damaged tissue and the scar tissue will start to form. The reflex activity resumes in the spinal cord below the level of injury. Any undamaged tracts will continue to conduct impulses through the level of damage. Control of reflexes below the level of damage is typically lost. All right, so if you're looking here, if you have a cervical injury, it can impair your breathing because of that phrenic nerve. Anything below that injury could be blocked, or you might not have any function, any reflexes. Okay, if it's shock, okay, it could start to return. But if there's permanent damage, permanent effects, it may not return. Two stages in the post-traumatic period: the early stages, spinal shock and increasing impairment, followed by the recovery and recognition of functional loss. During the initial period of spinal shock, all neurological activity ceases at, below, or slightly above the level of injury. No reflexes are present, including skeletal muscle, sensory, autonomic systems like bladder and bowel function. This condition can persist for days or weeks. During the period of spinal shock, signs include flaccid paralysis, sensory loss below the injured area, an absence of all reflex responses, and a loss of central control of autonomic function. So that flaccid paralysis, those reflexes will start to return when you start to recover. In patients with cervical injury, will have a loss of control of vasomotor tone, blood pressure, diaphoresis and body temperature, and bladder and bowel emptying. Blood pressure is low, and libol means it's all over the place, urinary retention, and paralytic ileus. In the recovery phase, we'll have gradual return to the reflex activity below the level of injury. No impulses, including reflexes, can pass through the area where there's damaged neurons. In most cases, hyperreflexia develops because the normal inhibitory or dampening impulses are not able to reach the level below the injury. Following recovery from spinal shock, the return of the reflexes, spastic paralysis, sensory deficits, and reflex or neurogenic bladder and bowel function are present below the level of damage. So we'll have incontinence, we'll have reflex defecation. Gradually, the permanent damage is revealed. Voluntary motor activity and sensory impulses are blocked at the level of damage. Effects of permanent damage would depend on the level at which the spinal cord trauma occurred. For example, a cervical injury would affect motor and sensory function in the trunks, the arms, and the legs, respiratory function, sympathetic nervous system function, and sacral parasympathetic fibers. In patients with cervical injuries, respiratory function may continue to be a matter of concern because of impairment to that phrenic nerve, loss of the intercostal muscle innervation. Blood pressure and temperature may be liable because the control center of the vasomotor, because the central control of the vasomotor tone and diaphoresis is lacking here. You should know these terms. So tetraplegia or quadriplegia is paralysis of all four extremities. Trauma in the lumbar region would interfere with function in the lower extremities and the sacroparasympathetic nerves. Partial cord injuries can lead to different patterns of impairment. Paraplegia is paralysis in the lower part of the trunk and the legs. And then ipsilateral paralysis and contralateral loss of pain and temperature sensation. This depends on the point of decussation and location. So remember, I talked about decussation pyramids earlier. That's where the nerves cross over to go to the opposite sides of the body. So depending on where that is injured, what area of the body that's going to affect. Autonomic dysreflexia, you have to know this. This is where we have a massive sympathetic flex response that's not controlled by the brain. It's often initiated by either infection, genital stimulation, or some other stimuli. So a lot of times we'll see this with bladder extension or constipation can stimulate this. Certain stimuli like if they get a chill or too tight of clothing can cause the stimulation of this. So what is the person going to have? They're going to have an increase in blood pressure, vasoconstriction below wherever the injury is on the spinal cord, but vasodilation above the injury, and then tachycardia. So they're having mixed symptoms. They're having parasympathetic symptoms and sympathetic nervous system symptoms at the same time. With injury of the cervical spine, stimulation of sympathetic system can result in autonomic dysreflexia. This complication is caused by a sensory stimulus that triggers a massive sympathetic reflex response that's not controlled by the brain. The trigger may be noxious stimulus in the body, but is most frequently a distended bladder or decubiti ulcer. Sensory stimulus to the sympathetic nervous system below the level of injury stimulates the entire chain of sympathetic nervous system ganglia, causing excessive vasoconstriction with a sudden increase in blood pressure, severe headache, and visual impairment. Bradycardia accompanies this syndrome because the vasoreceptors sense the high blood pressure and respond through the vagus nerve by slowing down the heart rate. So here we have that distended bladder. It sends out a signal. The stimulus enters the spinal cord and it moves up to where the area is damaged, but it's blocked there. Okay, so it activates the sympathetic nervous system below the lesion. It can't get through because of the lesion. The sympathetic outflow causes that sympathetic vasoconstriction, leading to the high blood pressure, the headache, and the visual problems. Baroreceptors sense the high blood pressure. The vasomotor stimulates the vasal nerve. That slows down the heart rate. The vagus nerve causes that bradycardia. That inhibits the sympathetic nervous system that's blocked by the damage. And we have to remove the cause of the stimulus in order to get the blood pressure back down now. So we'd have to empty that bladder, come in there and empty that bladder. Or if they were constipated, empty that stool. If they were having problems from that ulcer or that decubitus, then we might have to do something there. Complications of spinal cord injury are going to be things like urinary tract infections, contractures, skin breakdown, spasm, depression, complications because of immobility and loss of function, contractions from muscle spasms, decubitus from, being bedbound, They can have respiratory or urinary infections also from being immobile or because constant having to catheterize. Sexual function and reproductive function is also going to be affected here. Men can have neurogenic reflex erections, so they can have what we call priapism, where they have a sustained erection for a long period of time. And women usually resume their menstrual cycles once they've recovered from the acute trauma period. All right, next we're going to some of these brain issues, okay? Neurological disorders that are congenital. So hydrocephalus, this is where we have excess cerebral spinal fluid in the skull. Now with babies, they don't have those bones closed yet. So if you ever see a baby with this, their head's going to get really big. And it's sometimes called water on the brain. The production of cerebral spinal fluid is normal, but sometimes we have a reduction in the amount that's reabsorbed. There's two types, non-communicating and communicating. So non-communicating is also called obstructive. I would know this. This happens in babies when the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid is blocked at the aqueduct of Sylvius. That's non-communicating or obstructive. In communicating, the absorption of cerebral spinal fluid through the subarachnoid villi is impaired, and this causes an increased pressure of cerebral spinal fluid. Remember, we can't have that. Okay, so usually developmental abnormalities are the most common cause, either stenosis or atresia. And the obstruction comes from tumors, infections, or scar tissue at any age. It can also be caused by meningitis for the obstructive because the infection can impair absorption. Again, in babies, because the bones aren't closed there, the skull will expand to relieve the pressure. In older children, that's not going to happen because the skull is already closed there. So we have to be careful with them. In non-communicating or obstructive, the sutures of the skull have not yet closed. The infant's head enlarges as the amount of fluid increases. More cerebral spinal fluid is being produced here than absorbed because of some obstruction. All right, so again, this can come from stenosis, neurotube defects, myelomeningocele, Arnold-Chiari. Obstruction causes an increase in the pressure in the ventricles in the brain, and it causes dilation or enlargement of the ventricles, compressing the vessels and the brain tissue. Communicating hydrocephalus. This is when the absorption of cerebral spinal fluid through those finger-like projections, the subarachnoid villi, is impaired. And this causes increased pressure in the cerebral spinal fluid. Again, enlargement of the skull in the infant. In older adults, we'll see an increase in the pressure. And so we're going to see those symptoms. Increased blood pressure, increased pulse pressure, decreased heart rate, irregular respirations, vomiting, especially projectile vomiting that's not associated with food. So there's your baby there. They have what we call sunset eyes, so you can only see like the top half of the eyes if you look at it. The head will get a lot larger than that. Spina bifida, this is a neurotube defect. It usually comes from not eating enough folic acid or not taking in enough folic acid. But there are other genetic and environmental factors. There are three types: spina bifida occulta, and here the spinous processes just don't infuse. Meningocele, we have herniation of the meninges. The spinous processes do not infuse, and the meninges and the cerebral spinal fluid will form a sac on the surface of the back, on the outside of the spinal cord. Transillumination will confirm the absence of the nerve tissue in the sac. And then myelomeningocele, this is the most serious form of spina bifida. Here we have herniation of the spinal cord and the nerves along the meninges and the cerebral spinal fluid. And again, you're going to have neurological impairment, and the sac will form on the outside of the spinal cord. So spina bifida, the spinous processes do not fuse, but there's no herniation of the spinal cord or the meninges. And a lot of times, all you'll see is a little tuft of hair or a little dimple on the skin right there, okay, on the lower back. With meningocele, you'll have herniation of the meninges through a defect. The meninges and the cerebral spinal fluid form a sac on the surface. You can see the absence of the nerve tissue in the sac when we shine a light on that little sac on their back. And then myelomeningocele is the most serious form. Here we have herniation of spinal cord and nerves, along with the meninges and cerebral spinal fluid, and usually neurological impairment here. So there's the different three. I don't know if I have another picture here, but I would look it up. Just look it up. Look up the myelomeningocele, and look up images on Google, and you'll see a nice little picture there. All right, so spina bifida seems to be multifactorial, meaning we have genetic, environmental. There's a high incidence of spina bifida and associated defects like anencephaly. This is where they are born usually without a scalp, and you can see right down in the head. They're missing parts of the brain. So a lot of environmental factors: gestational diabetes, lack of folic acid, poor care during pregnancy, leaking alpha fetoprotein. They can do an amniocentesis for this. Signs and symptoms. So for meningocele or myelomeningocele with the protruding sac, we're going to see neurological deficits, sensory and motor impairment, and it's going to be below where the herniation is. Bladder and bowel control are usually going to be impaired here. Cerebral palsy. This is motor impairment caused by genetics, abnormal fetal formation. A lot of times you'll see this in women who took cocaine during pregnancy. Damage occurs in other areas of the brain. It could be variable for one person to the next. Damage can occur either before, during, or shortly after birth, but it doesn't progress. Whatever it is what it usually stays. So whatever amount of damage they have at birth is what they stay with for the remainder of their life. And the brain tissue is altered either because of malformation, mechanical trauma, hypoxia, hypoglycemia, too much bilirubin, infection, drugs. Here we can have general necrosis and atrophy of the brain tissue. In some clients, it only affects certain areas of the brain, maybe one or two. Again, it can be one or multiple factors. Hypoxia and ischemia are major causes of brain damage. This can happen during, before, during, or after birth. Hypoxia can be caused by placental complications. So maybe the placenta, for some reason, isn't providing adequate nutrient. High bilirubin levels that can come from either prematurity, Rh blood incompatibility, can cause kernicterus. And remember, I said that's too much bilirubin in the blood-brain barrier, and it damages the neurons. I would know that. Other causes of cerebral palsy would be infection or metabolic abnormalities, like hypoglycemia in either mom or the baby. All right, spastic is going to be damage to the pyramidal tracts. Remember, those are controlling movement. The motor cortex or general cortical damage. This is usually characterized by hyperreflexia. All right, so we have spastic paralysis. increased muscle tone, hyperreflexia. Dyskinetic, this is where damage is in the basal nuclei. So remember, that's movement. So they'll have writhy movements or facial grimaces or involuntary movement called coriform, where it's like a dancing type of movement. And ataxic cerebral palsy, where they lose their balance and coordination because the cerebellum is damaged. So right away you see cerebellum, that should trigger you to the loss of the balance. And ataxia, that's a balance problem. The motor deficits from cerebral palsy can be accompanied by other issues depending on what part of the brain is damaged. So it could affect intellectual problems, it could affect communication and speech, it could lead to seizures or visual problems. Most people with CP, or a lot of people with CP, have normal intelligence. Some of them are impaired mildly, and others are severely disabled cognitively. But a lot of people that you meet with CP can understand what you're saying to them and communicate with you. Communication and speech development are difficult because of motor disabilities, impaired mentation, or visual hearing deficits. Children with CP will have learning disabilities and behavioral problems like attention deficit disorder, spatial disorientation, and hyperactivity. Seizures, primarily tonic-clonic. Remember, that's that grand mal where you're jerking, you can become unconscious, you lose bowel and bladder. Again, seizure disorders, these are uncontrolled excessive discharge of neurons in the brain. It can be local or generalized. So, local is just in that one spot, general is throughout the body. They can be idiopathic or secondary. So, something else like a brain tumor or something can cause them. Fever can cause them, mostly in little kids. Alcohol withdrawal, drug withdrawal. All right. So it's sudden, spontaneous, uncontrolled depolarization of neurons. Again, I would know that. We have an altered pattern of electrical activity. It can be demonstrated on an EEG. A lot of them, they don't know why. Idiopathic. Okay. But other things that can trigger them are loud noises, bright lights, stress, hypoglycemia, hyperventilation. Usually we'll see a prodrome. So some kind of signs before it occurs, like picking their shirt, the aura, the taste, the smell, the sign, loss of consciousness, strong tonic muscle contractions. And then usually afterwards, they'll have a post-ictal period where they're sleepy. All right, multiple sclerosis. So this is progressive demyelination of the neurons of the brain, the spinal cord, and the cranial nerves. So we're missing that myelin sheath to everything. All right. So that's going to interfere with the conduction of impulses in the affected fibers. It can affect motor, sensory, and autonomic. We can see lesions, inflammation, loss of the myelin in the white matter. They can develop plaques in the brain, inflammation, demyelination. The main thing you want to remember here is they're losing the myelin sheath. They become demyelinated. Okay, that can cause those plaques. It can cause problems with movement, depending on what's affected. Usually comes on around the age of 20. It can recur, so they can have remissions, exacerbations. Usually between the ages of 20 to 40. They don't know why. It could be autoimmune, it could be nutritional, some are genetic. Symptoms, okay? Blurred vision, weakness in the legs from the plaques on the cortical spinal tract. Remember, those carry that movement signal, right? We're not moving here. Paresthesia, numbness, burning, tingling if the sensory nerves are affected. So, progressive weakness and paralysis from those plaques. Loss of coordination, bladder, bowel, sexual dysfunction, fatigue from that demyelination and those plaques. Again, it's affecting everything here: the cerebellum, the cranial nerves, the motor nerves. Destroyed or damaged myelin. Parkinson's is next. Well, Parkinson's, this is a progressive degenerative disorder. It affects motor function by losing EPS. Now, EPS is our movement, right? So this is causing problems in that basal nuclei where the movement is. Imbalance between excitation and inhibition. Excessive stimulation affects the movement and the posture. So it leads to things like tremors when you're resting, muscular rigidity, postural instability. Usually develops after 60, it can be primary or idiopathic. It can also develop secondary to things like encephalitis, trauma, vascular disease. Primary usually happens after 60 in men and women. So what are you going to see? Fatigue, muscle weakness, um, changes in the facial expression from the rigidity, decreased flexibility, tremors in the hands at rest, pill rolling motion. So again, those extra pyramidal, because this is affecting the basal ganglia, the movement in the body. Later on, tremors to the hands, feet, and face, increased muscle rigidity, difficulty initiating movements, slow movements, posture stooped, leaning forward. Okay, it can also affect their ability to articulate because it affects the muscles in the throat, and that can affect your chewing, your swallowing. It can cause drooling. It can affect your ability to articulate your words. They might have a mask like face. Autonomic dysfunction, orthostatic hypotension, urinary tracts, dementia, ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Again, no cause. There are some genes that are linked to it. This causes progressive degeneration of upper motor neurons. So in your cerebral cortex, your processing center. So it's affecting those upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. So eventually, these people are going to totally succumb to no movement. They won't even be able to cough or swallow on their own, but it doesn't affect their cognition. They lose the upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex. That causes the spastic paralysis, the hyperreflexia, damage to the lower motor neurons, which is causing the flaccid paralysis, the decrease in the muscle tone and the reflexes. This can move up Okay, so it causes progressive muscle weakness, loss of motor coordination, stumbling and falls, and then eventually the respiratory system is going to fail here. Myasthenia gravis. This is an autoimmune disorder. They develop auto antibodies to the acetylcholine. It destroys the receptor sites and it prevents muscle stimulation because remember, the acetylcholine helps stimulate that muscle contraction. Causes skeletal muscle weakness. It can affect the facial and the ocular muscles, and it usually does so first. It can cause dysphagia and aspiration. Usually happens between 20 and 30 years old. A lot of these clients will have problems with their thymus or tumors on their thymus. Signs and symptoms are going to be muscle weakness in the face and the eyes, impaired vision, diplopia, ptosis, difficulty chewing, upper respiratory infections. Huntington's disease. This one's a tough one because this doesn't develop till you're usually in your 50s. This says greater than 40. Usually they're in their 50s when we see this. Huntington's disease or chorea, this is inherited as autosomal dominant. So you only need one bad trait from one of your parents to get this. It doesn't usually appear until midlife. It causes progressive atrophy of the brain. So our brain is shrinking. Our number of neurons is shrinking here, especially in the basal ganglia and the frontal cortex. So this is going to affect your ability to think. It's going to affect your movement. We have depletion of GABA. So that can cause you to become what? Fearful, anxious, because that's supposed to inhibit. We have the acetylcholine in the brain being reduced here. Okay, so again, that's going to all affect movement. So onset, we'll see mood swings, personality changes, restlessness, and coriform, which is those rapid, jerky movement in the arm and the face, intellectual impairment. So we can't learn new things because the cerebral cortex, the frontal lobe, difficulty learning, loss of problem solving skills, poor judgment. It's going to be progressive. And then rigidity, akinesia. So they're going to have problems with movement, personality changes, moody. Dementia. This is progressive chronic disease. Here, the cortical function, remember that's responsible for your cognitive thinking. So we have impaired cognitive skills, impaired thinking, judgment, learning, memory loss, confusion, behavioral personality changes. It could be short term or recent memory mostly, but there's some confusion also with long term. This can be vascular, from infections, from toxins, genetic disorders. All these can lead to dementia. Alzheimer's is when we have progressive intellectual function, progressive cortical atrophy, and the hallmark here is the neurofibrillary tangles and plaques and the acetylcholine deficit caused by the loss of neurons. Those are the hallmark. You got to know that. So we see personality changes, lack of initiative, impairment in judgment. The progressive cortical atrophy causes dilated ventricles, widening of the sulci, the neurofibrillary tangles in the neurons, and the senile plaques are in large numbers of the brain that's affected. This disrupts the ability of the nerves to conduct. It also has fragments of protein in there called beta amyloid. We see a deficit of acetylcholine here. That's just showing you the neurofibrillary tangles and the amyloid plaques. Things you got to know, okay, about this disease is the amyloid plaques, the neurofibrillary tangles, the decrease in the acetylcholine. That is all going to affect the memory because that's really what's affected here. Signs and symptoms. It lasts for 10 to 20 years. Behavioral changes, irritability, hostility, gradual loss of memory and concentration, poor judgment, change in food intake, inability to recognize family or environmental awareness, incontinence, inability to function. Eventually, this can lead to death. And as they enter into that late stage, they're going to not be able to function at all. So top is regular, B is Alzheimer's. You also have vascular dementia. This is usually caused because of some sort of vascular issue. Okay. Small infarctions, strokes, TIAs, anything that's causing damage. Now, TIA won't cause permanent damage, but the CVA will. Also, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs, which we talked about already. This is from eating those proteins, that prion protein transmitted through contaminated blood. You can get it from a blood transfusion, from eating contaminated beef. Sometimes they don't know. We might get it from a transplant, from surgery. Has a long incubation period. It can cause memory loss, behavioral changes, progressive dementia, and death. AIDS dementia. This happens in your HIV patients once they go to AIDS, and that AIDS continues on. The virus invades the brain tissue, and it can cause things like memory loss. Other infectious diseases like your funguses, your toxoplasmas can also cause some damage here. So here we'll see loss of memory, impaired motor function, ataxia, weakness, abnormal reflexes. And then we have some mental disorders like schizophrenia, depression, and panic. So here we have problems typically with neurotransmitters and some of the biochemical and structural components of the brain. These are usually considered genetic components, so probably passed on from somebody in the family. Your more serious ones are schizophrenia, delusional disorders, some of your affective or mood disorders. With schizophrenia, usually we see a problem with the dopamine here. We also see some brain changes, so reduction in the gray matter in the temporal lobes, enlarged third and lateral ventricles, abnormal cells in the hippocampus, excessive dopamine, decreased blood flow to the frontal lobes, which control all that cognitive thinking. We consider this to be either genetic or from brain damage. That's the main ways that they think that you get it. They can have positive symptoms like delusions, bizarre behavior, or negative symptoms like emotions that are flat, something called anhedonia, where you really love Christmas and now all of a sudden you have no interest in it. Decreased speech, and then they have disorganized thoughts, impaired communication, and false beliefs or delusions. Depression. This happens with people a lot of times if they have chronic illness. It's considered a mood disorder. It could be just by itself, or you could have bipolar depression where you have periods of mania and depression. Usually this is considered genetic, developmental, or psychosocial. It comes from a decrease in the activity by the excitatory neurotransmitters. So we have a decrease usually in norepinephrine and serotonin. They really don't know why, but they do say that post-traumatic stress, concussions, being exposed to stress for long periods of time can all contribute to damage here. With depression, we'll see a lack of energy, a loss of self-esteem, irritability, insomnia, loss of appetite, and libido. Panic attack. This is a sudden, brief episode of discomfort and anxiety. With panic attacks, they can be common, but they don't necessarily lead to panic disorder. Panic disorder is when you have frequent panic attacks or prolonged panic attacks. There are genetic factors here. So increased discharges of neurons in the temporal lobes, neurotransmitter abnormalities are norepinephrine, serotonin, and GABA. So likely an increase in the norepinephrine, an increase in the serotonin, or a decrease in the GABA. We'll also see irritability of the limbic system with these clients. Signs and symptoms would be intense fear without provocation. It can last for minutes or hours, and their body's going to experience things like palpitations, hyperventilation, sweating. They might feel like they're choking or they can't breathe. And then last is a couple of spinal cord issues. So herniated disc, this would involve protrusion of the nucleus part of the disc, tear in the capsule that causes leaking or fluid to leak out of that area. This can impair sensory, motor, or autonomic dysfunction. The location could be in the lumbosacral disc. Some herniations happen in the cervical disc. And if the pressure is prolonged, it could cause additional damage. Predisposition to herniated discs can be degenerative changes from aging, metabolic changes from obesity. You could have it from trauma, like a motor vehicle accident, or from poor body mechanics. Again, the symptoms would depend on where it is located. Sometimes the effects are unilateral, and sometimes if you have a large protrusion, it can cause bilateral effects. And last of that is herniated, the diagnostic and the treatment, which you don't need to know. And that's it. That is chapter 14. That was a lot, right? But hopefully you learned something today. Monday, or not Monday, Wednesday we meet again, right? Wednesday morning for the day class and Monday evening for the evening class. So tomorrow night in the evening class, we'll go over questions for this, and the same for the day to prepare you for your quiz. Your quiz this week is chapter 14 only. So if I said you need to know it, you better know it.
Thank you.
Recorded once it's
Thank
uploaded.
you.
You're welcome. It may
Thanks,
take a
Miss
while
Walsh.
for this to upload, but I will put
Thank
it up.
you.
Okay?
This chapter is a beast.
It's a beast. But a lot of this stuff we've already covered.